March 3rd, 2025. Polar Bear Malls airliner crew on runway in Greenland. March 3rd, 2025. Polar Bear Malls airliner crew on runway in Greenland. The Arctic wind carried whispers of death across the tarmac of Nuuk Airport as Captain Sarah Mitchell performed her final pre-flight checks aboard Atlantic Airways Flight 447. The Boeing 737-800 sat poised on the runway like a metallic bird preparing for migration, its engines humming with the promise of escape from Greenland's frozen grip. None of the 127 souls aboard could have imagined that within minutes they would become witnesses to one of the most horrific wildlife attacks in aviation history. Captain Mitchell, a 43-year-old veteran pilot from Copenhagen with over 15,000 flight hours, glanced at her co-pilot, First Officer Lars Andersen. The 36-year-old had been flying the Greenland routes for 8 years and knew the unique challenges of Arctic aviation better than most. His weathered hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced precision, checking fuel levels, engine parameters, and communication systems. "Weather report shows clear skies to Reykjavik," Andersen said, his Danish accent thick in the confined cockpit. "Winds picking up from the northwest, but nothing we haven't handled before." Behind them, in the passenger cabin, Flight Attendant Chief Elena Rossi was conducting her final safety briefing to a mix of Greenlandic locals heading to Iceland, Danish business travelers, and a handful of tourists eager to escape the harsh Arctic winter. The 40-year-old Italian had worked international routes for nearly 2 decades, but the Nuuk-Reykjavik run remained one of her favorites despite its challenges. Among the passengers sat Dr. Marcus Thompson, a marine biologist from the University of British Columbia who had spent the last 3 months studying Arctic sea ice patterns. The 51-year-old researcher clutched a briefcase containing crucial climate data that would inform his next research paper. Beside him, his research assistant, 28-year-old Jennifer Park, reviewed their findings one final time on her laptop. "I'll miss the ice," Dr. Thompson murmured, gazing through the small window at the stark landscape surrounding Newark Airport. "But I won't miss the cold." Jennifer smiled, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. Despite the aircraft's heating system, the Greenlandic cold seemed to seep through the metal hull. "At least we'll be in Reykjavik before dark. I'm looking forward to a hot meal that doesn't come from a can." Several rows back, Greenlandic politician Malik Kleist was returning to Iceland for parliamentary sessions. The 47-year-old had served his community for over a decade and had made this journey countless times. Today felt different, though he couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the unusual wildlife activity his constituents had reported near town in recent weeks. Polar bears venturing closer to human settlements wasn't unheard of, but the frequency had increased dramatically. Across the aisle, Danish journalist Astrid Sørensen was typing rapidly on her phone, finishing a story about climate change impacts on Greenlandic communities. The 39-year-old investigative reporter had spent 2 weeks documenting how rising temperatures were affecting traditional hunting patterns and wildlife behavior. Her editor was expecting the piece within hours. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Sarah Mitchell's voice came over the intercom. "We've been cleared for departure and expect a smooth flight to Reykjavik. Flight time today should be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your seatbacks are in their upright position." Outside the aircraft, the ground crew was conducting their final inspections. Jonas Peterson, a 34-year-old aircraft mechanic who had worked at Newark Airport for 12 years, was performing his customary walk-around inspection. The father of 3 had immigrated to Greenland from Denmark after falling in love with both the landscape and his Greenlandic wife Nayeli. His colleague, Erik Larsen, a 41-year-old baggage handler and aircraft marshal, was ensuring the cargo hold was properly secured. Jonas had grown up in Aalborg before the call of adventure brought him to the Arctic. Eric, originally from the Faroe Islands, had found his way to Greenland 15 years earlier and never looked back. Both men were experienced professionals who understood the unique challenges of working in one of the world's most remote airports. The wind had been particularly fierce that morning, with gusts reaching 45 kilometers per hour. Snow had fallen intermittently throughout the night, leaving a fresh layer of powder across the tarmac that the ground crews had worked tirelessly to clear. The temperature hovered at -18 degrees Celsius, typical for early March in Nuuk, but brutal for prolonged outdoor work. Airport Operations Manager Soren Bjornsson watched the proceedings from the control tower, his experienced eye scanning for any potential issues. The 62-year-old had overseen Nuuk airport operations for 28 years and had seen every conceivable weather condition and emergency scenario. What he hadn't seen, what none of them had anticipated, was already making its way across the frozen landscape toward the airport perimeter. The polar bear that would forever change the lives of everyone present that day was an adult male, approximately 8 years old and weighing nearly 450 kilograms. Designated as M47 by wildlife researchers who had tagged him 3 years earlier, he was a magnificent and terrifying specimen of Ursus maritimus. His yellowed fur, stained by seal blood and weathered by Arctic storms, covered a massive frame built for survival in one of Earth's most hostile environments. For weeks, M47 had been tracking an increasingly elusive food supply as changing ice conditions forced him farther from his traditional hunting grounds. The sea ice, which should have been at its maximum extent in March, was unusually thin and unstable. Climate patterns that had remained consistent for millennia were shifting with alarming speed, forcing Arctic predators to adapt or perish. Dr. Ingrid Rasmussen, a polar bear specialist with the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources, had been tracking M47's movements via satellite collar for months. The 38-year-old biologist had noticed concerning behavioral changes in several bears, including increased proximity to human settlements. Her reports to wildlife authorities had grown increasingly urgent, but bureaucratic processes moved slowly in Greenland's complex governmental structure. The bears are being forced into contact with humans at unprecedented rates, she had written in her latest report, filed just 2 weeks before March 3rd. We're observing hunting pattern disruptions that could lead to aggressive encounters. Immediate action is required to implement enhanced monitoring and potential relocation protocols. Her warnings, buried in governmental red tape, would prove tragically prophetic. As M47 approached the airport's outer perimeter, his keen sense of smell detected the complex mixture of aviation fuel, human activity, and food waste from the terminal's cafeteria. To a bear that hadn't eaten a substantial meal in over a week, these scents represented potential salvation. The chain-link fence surrounding the airport posed no significant barrier to an animal capable of swimming dozens of kilometers through icy Arctic waters. Inside the aircraft, passenger James Morrison, a 44-year-old oil industry consultant from Aberdeen, was reviewing geological surveys on his tablet. The Scottish engineer had spent 6 months in Greenland assessing potential extraction sites and was eager to return to his wife and 2 teenage daughters. His work required frequent travel to remote locations, but Greenland's isolation was particularly challenging. Another successful trip to the end of the world, he muttered to himself, closing his tablet and preparing for takeoff. 2 rows ahead, elderly passenger Kirsten Olsen was returning to Reykjavik after visiting her grandson in Nuuk. The 73-year-old Icelandic woman had made this journey twice yearly for the past decade, ever since her daughter married a Greenlandic fisherman. Her arthritic hands gripped the armrest tightly. Despite numerous flights, she had never overcome her fear of takeoff. In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell was receiving final clearance from air traffic control. Controller Anna Thomason, a 31-year-old who had worked at Nuuk Airport for 7 years, was managing the departure sequence with her characteristic precision. The Greenlandic woman had grown up in Nuuk and understood the critical importance of aviation to her community's connection with the outside world. Atlantic Airways 447, you are cleared for takeoff. Runway 23, Anna's voice crackled through the radio. Winds northwest at 40 kilometers per hour. Visibility unlimited. Cleared for takeoff, runway 23, Atlantic Airways 447, Captain Mitchell responded, advancing the throttles as First Officer Anderson called out engine parameters. Outside on the tarmac, Jonas Peterson was completing his final visual inspection of the aircraft's exterior. His trained eye checked for ice accumulation on the wings, proper position of control surfaces, and any signs of damage or wear. The bitter wind cut through his insulated coveralls, but years of Arctic work had conditioned him to the cold. Erik Larsen had finished securing the cargo hold and was positioning himself to guide the aircraft's pushback from the gate. His fluorescent marshalling wands were ready, and he had established eye contact with the cockpit crew. Both ground crew members were veterans of countless departures and approached their duties with professional competence, born from years of experience. The first sign that something was amiss came from Security Officer Peder Hansen, a 49-year-old former military policeman who patrolled the airport perimeter. As he conducted his routine fence inspection, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. What he initially assumed was a large dog or possibly a stray reindeer quickly resolved into something far more dangerous. Control tower, this is Hansen on perimeter patrol. He radioed, his voice tight with concern. I have a polar bear approaching the northwest fence line, approximately 200 meters from runway 23. In the control tower, Anna Thomason's blood ran cold. Polar bear encounters at the airport were extremely rare, but not unheard of. Protocol required immediate notification of all ground personnel and potential flight delays until the situation could be assessed. All ground units, this is Control Tower, she announced over the airport frequency. We have a polar bear sighting near the northwest perimeter. All outdoor personnel maintain heightened awareness and report any visual contact immediately. Jonas Peterson, focused on his inspection checklist, didn't initially register the radio call over the howling wind. His attention was devoted to checking the aircraft's nose gear for signs of ice accumulation or hydraulic leaks. The methodical nature of his work, honed by thousands of similar inspections, created a tunnel vision that blocked out peripheral distractions. Erik Larsen, standing 20 meters away near the aircraft's wingtip, heard the radio transmission clearly. He immediately began scanning the area, but initially saw nothing concerning. The airport's layout, with its various buildings, equipment, and aircraft, created numerous blind spots that could conceal a large animal. Inside the aircraft, the passengers were unaware of the developing situation. Dr. Thompson was reviewing his research notes one final time, while Jennifer Park had closed her laptop and was preparing for takeoff. The academic routine of their work had insulated them from the harsh realities of Arctic wildlife management. Security Officer Hansen was now tracking the bear's movement with increasing alarm. M47 had cleared the perimeter fence with surprising ease, his massive form moving with the fluid grace that belied his enormous size. The bear's behavior patterns suggested confusion and agitation rather than immediate aggression, but Hansen understood that the situation could change rapidly. Control tower. The bear has breached the perimeter and is moving toward the active runway area, Hansen reported, his voice now carrying unmistakable urgency. I'm moving to intercept, but will need immediate backup from wildlife control. Airport wildlife management fell under the jurisdiction of Greenlandic authorities, but the nearest qualified responders were in Nuuk proper, at least 15 minutes away under ideal conditions. The airport's emergency protocols included provisions for wildlife encounters, but actual polar bear incidents had been theoretical until this moment. Operations manager Soren Bjornsson was now facing a crisis that his decades of experience had never fully prepared him for. The decision matrix was complex. Ground the departing aircraft and potentially strand passengers for hours or days, or attempt to clear the bear from the runway area quickly enough to maintain the flight schedule. Hansen, what's the bear's current position and behavior? Bjornsson radioed from the tower. Approximately 100 meters north of runway 23, moving slowly toward the taxiway area, Hansen responded. The animal appears disoriented, but not immediately threatening. However, I cannot guarantee the situation will remain stable. In the aircraft cockpit, Captain Mitchell and First Officer Anderson had heard the radio traffic and were assessing their options. Aviation safety protocols in Arctic regions included specific procedures for wildlife encounters, but polar bears presented unique challenges due to their size, speed, and potential aggression. We should probably delay departure until this is resolved, Anderson suggested, his hand hovering over the engine controls. Captain Mitchell nodded, but before she could respond, the situation on the ground changed dramatically. M47 had detected the movement and scent signatures of Jonas Peterson and Erik Larsen. To a hungry predator operating on instinct, these bipedal figures represented either potential threats or possible prey. The bear's behavior shifted from curious exploration to focused stalking as he began moving deliberately toward the two ground crew members. Jonas Peterson, still absorbed in his inspection routine, was crouched beside the aircraft's nose gear when the bear emerged from behind a ground service vehicle. The distance between predator and prey was less than 30 meters, well within the polar bear's explosive charge radius. Erik Larsen, positioned with a clear view of the runway area, was the first to see M47 in full clarity. The sight of nearly half a ton of Arctic predator moving with purposeful intent toward his colleague triggered every survival instinct in his body. "Jonas! Bear! Run!" Erik screamed, his voice carrying across the tarmac despite the howling wind. The marshalling wands fell from Erik's hands as he began running toward his colleague, though whether to help or simply flee was unclear even to him. Human responses to extreme danger are often illogical, driven by adrenaline and instinct rather than rational thought. Jonas Peterson's head snapped up at Erik's warning, his mind requiring several crucial seconds to process the impossible sight before him. A polar bear, the Arctic's apex predator, was advancing across the airport tarmac with the fluid, ground-covering gait that had made his species legendary among Inuit hunters for millennia. Training and experience evaporated in the face of primal terror. Jonas scrambled backward, his heavy winter boots slipping on the icy tarmac as he attempted to put distance between himself and the approaching bear. The aircraft's massive bulk blocked his retreat in one direction, while the bear's position cut off escape routes toward the terminal building. Inside the aircraft, passengers near the windows were beginning to notice the commotion outside. Dr. Thompson, seated in row 12 on the port side, had an excellent view of the developing crisis. "My God," he whispered, pressing his face to the small window. "There's a polar bear on the runway." Jennifer Park leaned across the aisle to look out the opposite window. Her marine biology background had included enough Arctic ecology to understand the gravity of what they were witnessing. "That's a big male," she said, her scientific training overriding her shock. "Probably around 400 to 500 kilograms, based on size comparison to the ground crew." Word of the bear sighting spread rapidly through the passenger cabin, creating a wave of excitement, concern, and camera phones. For most of the passengers, polar bears existed only in documentaries and zoos. The reality of seeing one in the wild, particularly in such proximity to human activity, was both thrilling and terrifying. Passenger James Morrison, the oil consultant from Scotland, had experience with wildlife encounters in remote locations. His understanding of polar bear behavior was limited, but sufficient to recognize the extreme danger facing the ground crew. "Those men are in serious trouble," he told his seatmate, elderly Kirsten Olsen, whose face had gone pale at the sight of the massive predator. In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell was now in direct communication with the control tower, trying to coordinate a response that could save lives while maintaining operational safety. "Tower, we have visual on the polar bear from the cockpit," she reported. "2 ground crew members appear to be in immediate danger. What's the status of wildlife control response?" "Atlantic Airways 447. Wildlife control is en route, but at least 10 minutes out," Anna Thomason responded. "Emergency services are being dispatched, but immediate response capabilities are limited. The limitations of operating in one of the world's most remote airports were becoming tragically apparent." Nuuk Airport, despite its critical importance to Greenland's transportation infrastructure, lacked the specialized equipment and personnel to handle major wildlife emergencies. On the tarmac, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. M47 had closed the distance to Jonas Peterson to approximately 15 meters and showed no signs of backing down. The bear's body language had shifted from curious exploration to active hunting behavior. His massive head was lowered, ears flattened against his skull, and his powerful muscles were coiled for explosive action. Jonas Peterson, trapped between the aircraft and the approaching predator, made a decision that would haunt the survivors for years to come. Instead of remaining still and hoping the bear would lose interest, he attempted to retreat further, moving toward the aircraft's tail section in hopes of finding shelter behind the engine nacelles. The sudden movement triggered M47's predatory response. 8 years of Arctic survival had honed the bear's hunting instincts to lethal perfection. With a speed that defied his massive size, M47 launched into a charge that covered the remaining distance in less than 3 seconds. Erik Larsen, running toward his colleague despite every instinct screaming at him to flee, was still 20 meters away when the bear reached Jonas. What followed was a demonstration of nature's raw power that no amount of safety training or emergency preparation could have prevented. The impact of M47's initial charge sent Jonas Peterson tumbling across the icy tarmac like a discarded toy. The sound of the collision carried clearly through the thin Arctic air, a sickening combination of breaking bones and tearing fabric that would echo in the nightmares of everyone who heard it. Inside the aircraft, passengers pressed against the windows in horrified fascination. Dr. Thompson found himself providing unwanted commentary as his scientific background compelled him to observe and analyze, even in the face of human tragedy. "Polar bears are incredibly powerful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They can break through ice 2 feet thick. A human body offers no resistance at all." Flight attendant Elena Rossi was moving through the cabin, trying to maintain order as passengers craned to see the attack unfolding outside. Her experience dealing with in-flight emergencies had never prepared her for the psychological challenge of watching helplessly as human beings were attacked by a wild animal. "Please remain in your seats and fasten your seatbelts," she announced, though her voice lacked its usual authority. The professional composure that had carried her through countless flights was cracking under the strain of witnessing something no human should ever see. On the tarmac, Erik Larsen had reached the vicinity of the attack, but was now faced with an impossible choice. Approaching the bear might save Jonas, but would almost certainly result in his own death. Fleeing might preserve his own life, but would abandon his colleague to a horrible fate. The decision was made for him when M47, having knocked Jonas to the ground, turned his attention to the second human. The bear's predatory instincts, now fully activated, recognized Eric as another potential threat or prey item. The distance between them was perhaps 10 meters, easily covered by a charging polar bear in less than 2 seconds. Eric Larsson's final act was one of remarkable courage and futility. Rather than turning to flee, he picked up a piece of ground service equipment, a heavy metal chock used to secure aircraft wheels, and hurled it at the massive predator. The improvised weapon struck M47 in the shoulder with sufficient force to momentarily distract him, but served only to redirect his attention fully onto Eric. The second charge was, if anything, more devastating than the first. M47's 450 kilograms of muscle and fury struck Eric Larsson with the force of a small vehicle. The sound of the impact reverberated across the tarmac and through the aircraft's hull, where passengers sat in stunned silence. Security officer Peder Hansen had reached the scene, but was armed only with a standard-issue pistol, wholly inadequate for stopping a polar bear in full attack mode. His military training included combat situations, but nothing comparable to facing an apex predator with only a sidearm for protection. "Shots fired! Shots fired on the tarmac!" Hansen radioed as he emptied his weapon at the bear. The small-caliber rounds, designed for human threats, had minimal effect on M47's massive frame. If anything, the gunfire served only to further agitate the already enraged animal. In the control tower, operations manager Soren Bjornsson was coordinating emergency responses from multiple agencies while trying to maintain operational control of the airport. The radio traffic had become a chaos of overlapping transmissions as various emergency services attempted to respond to an unprecedented crisis. "All emergency units. We have multiple casualties on runway 23 with an active polar bear attack in progress," he broadcast. "Immediate medical and wildlife control response required. Airport is now closed to all traffic." The nearest properly equipped wildlife control unit was based in Nuuk, but had been deployed to a separate incident involving a seal entanglement 30 kilometers north of the city. The backup response team, consisting of local police officers with minimal wildlife training, was still 15 minutes from the airport. Inside the aircraft, the psychological impact of witnessing the attack was affecting passengers and crew differently. Some, like Dr. Thompson, became clinically analytical as a coping mechanism. Others, including several children on board, were becoming hysterical with fear and trauma. Passenger Malik Kleist, the Greenlandic politician, was trying to calm a young family seated nearby while processing the implications of what he was witnessing. As an elected representative, he understood that this incident would have far-reaching consequences for Arctic aviation safety and wildlife management policies. "This shouldn't have happened," he said to no one in particular. "We've had protocols in place for years. Something went wrong with the warning systems." Danish journalist Astrid Sørensen, despite the horror of the situation, found herself mentally composing the story that would dominate international headlines within hours. Her professional instincts, honed by years of covering difficult news, kicked in even as her human empathy recoiled from the tragedy unfolding outside. On the tarmac, M47 was now standing over both fallen ground crew members, his massive frame blocking the view from most of the aircraft windows. The bear's behavior had shifted again, from active aggression to protective guarding of what he perceived as his prize. This behavioral change actually made the situation more dangerous for potential rescuers, as interrupting a feeding polar bear was exponentially more hazardous than facing one in normal circumstances. Security officer Hansen, having exhausted his ammunition to no visible effect, was now maintaining a safe distance while trying to coordinate the emergency response. His law enforcement training emphasized securing the scene and preserving life, but the realities of facing a polar bear with standard police equipment made both objectives nearly impossible. "Medical teams, be advised that the scene is not secure," he radioed. The bear is still active and has shown no response to gunfire. Specialized wildlife control is essential before any rescue attempt. The medical response team, consisting of paramedics from Nuuk Hospital, was staging at the airport terminal but could not approach the casualties until the bear was neutralized or relocated. The limitation created a horrific catch-22 situation where potentially life-saving medical intervention was blocked by the ongoing presence of the predator. Dr. Malik Peterson, the senior emergency physician at Nuuk Hospital and coincidentally a distant cousin of Jonas Peterson, was among the medical responders. The 45-year-old had treated numerous trauma cases during his career, but had never faced the unique challenges of providing emergency care in an active wildlife encounter. Even if we could reach them immediately, the extent of injuries from a polar bear attack, he said to his colleague, paramedic Lisa Anderson, "We need to be prepared for the worst possible scenario." Inside the aircraft, Captain Mitchell was facing decisions that had no clear precedence in aviation emergency procedures. The safety of her passengers and crew was paramount, but the ground crew situation demanded consideration of potential rescue operations that might require aircraft evacuation or repositioning. "Tower, what's the status of getting that bear away from our ground crew?" she asked, her professional composure masking deep personal concern for Jonas and Eric, both of whom she had worked with regularly over the past 5 years. "Atlantic Airways 447, Wildlife Control ETA is still 8 minutes, Anna Thomason responded. "We're coordinating with Greenlandic authorities for additional support, but options are extremely limited." First Officer Lars Anderson was monitoring emergency frequencies and trying to maintain situational awareness as multiple agencies converged on the airport. His experience flying in Arctic conditions had included theoretical training for wildlife encounters, but the reality far exceeded anything covered in textbooks or simulator sessions. "Should we consider evacuating the aircraft?" he asked Captain Mitchell. "If this situation deteriorates further, we might need to clear the area quickly." The question highlighted the complex decision matrix facing aviation professionals during an unprecedented crisis. Standard emergency evacuation procedures assumed threats to the aircraft itself, not external predator attacks that made evacuation potentially more dangerous than remaining aboard. Outside, M47 was exhibiting behavior patterns that wildlife specialists would later analyze extensively. The bear's response to the airport environment, human presence and gunfire provided crucial data about polar bear adaptability and threat assessment in human-modified landscapes. Dr. Ingrid Rasmussen, the polar bear specialist who had been tracking M47 for months, received the emergency call while conducting fieldwork 40 kilometers from Nuuk. Her immediate response revealed both professional expertise and personal anguish at the confirmation of her worst fears. "This is exactly what I've been warning about," she told her research assistant while racing toward her helicopter. "Climate disruption is forcing bears into human contact zones with increasing frequency. This attack was predictable and preventable." The helicopter journey to Nuuk Airport would take 12 minutes under ideal conditions, but weather patterns were deteriorating as afternoon approached. Dr. Rasmussen carried specialized tranquilizer equipment and had the expertise to safely immobilize M47, but reaching the scene in time to prevent further tragedy remained uncertain. Meanwhile, the first properly equipped wildlife response team was approaching the airport perimeter. Officer Tommy Ling, a 36-year-old with extensive experience in polar bear management, carried a high-powered rifle capable of stopping even the largest Arctic predators. His partner, Officer Nivi Peterson, no relation to Jonas, had specialized training in wildlife behavior and emergency tranquilization techniques. "This is Wildlife Unit 1, approaching the airport from the northeast entrance," Tommy radioed. We have visual on the incident scene and are preparing for immediate intervention. The arrival of specialized personnel marked a crucial turning point in the emergency response, though the ultimate outcome for Jonas Peterson and Erik Larsen remained grimly uncertain. Both men had been motionless since M47's initial attacks, though whether from unconsciousness, severe injury or worse was impossible to determine from a distance. Inside the aircraft, the prolonged nature of the crisis was taking a psychological toll on passengers and crew. What had begun as shocked fascination was evolving into traumatic stress as the reality of witnessing potential human deaths settled over everyone aboard. Child passenger Aput Josefsson, an 8-year-old Greenlandic boy traveling with his grandmother to visit relatives in Iceland, was asking questions that the adults struggled to answer. "Why is the bear angry?" he asked in Greenlandic, his innocent voice carrying through the cabin's tense silence. "Mama always said bears only hurt people who hurt them first." His grandmother, Sarah Josefsson, a 72-year-old traditional hunter's widow, understood polar bear behavior better than most passengers, but struggled to explain the complex factors that had led to this tragedy. "The ice is changing, Aput," she said softly. "The bears are hungry and confused. They don't know where they belong anymore." Her words carried deeper implications that the other passengers could only partially grasp. Climate change was disrupting ancient patterns that had governed Arctic ecosystems for millennia, forcing adaptations that sometimes brought predators into direct conflict with human activities. On the tarmac, Wildlife Officer Tommy Ling was now in position to engage M47, but the tactical situation was complicated by the bear's proximity to the casualties. A clean shot that would instantly neutralize the predator required precise positioning and timing that the current circumstances made extremely challenging. "Control tower, this is Wildlife Unit 1, he radioed. "I have the bear in sight, but the casualties are directly beneath the animal. Any movement to improve my shooting angle risks triggering another attack." The tactical dilemma faced by emergency responders highlighted the unique challenges of Arctic wildlife management. In most environments, dangerous animals could be isolated from human populations, but the extreme conditions of Greenland created unavoidable contact zones where conflicts were increasingly likely. Operations Manager Soren Bjornsson was coordinating between multiple agencies while trying to maintain overall command of the emergency response. His decades of experience managing airport operations had never prepared him for the complexity of a polar bear attack, but his leadership would prove crucial in the chaotic minutes that followed. "Wildlife Unit 1, you are authorized to use whatever force necessary to secure the scene," he radioed. "Medical teams are standing by for immediate casualty evacuation once the area is safe." The authorization carried enormous weight and responsibility. Tommy Linger's next actions would determine whether Jonas Peterson and Erik Larsen had any chance of survival, while also deciding the fate of M47, a magnificent predator whose only crime was following instincts shaped by millions of years of evolution. Dr. Ingrid Rasmussen's helicopter was now approaching the airport from the northeast, battling increasingly turbulent winds that made precision landing difficult. Through the aircraft's side window, she could see the entire scene laid out below, the massive white form of M47 standing over his victims, the emergency vehicles maintaining their safe perimeter, and the commercial aircraft filled with traumatized passengers. "This is Dr. Rasmussen inbound with tranquilizer capability," she radioed. "Do not engage the bear with lethal force until I can attempt immobilization." Her transmission created immediate tension among the emergency responders. The welfare of human casualties typically took absolute precedence over wildlife conservation, but Dr. Rasmussen's expertise and specialized equipment offered the possibility of saving both human and animal lives. Wildlife Officer Tommy Ling acknowledged the transmission while maintaining his shooting position. His training emphasized human safety above all other considerations. But the potential for a non-lethal resolution created a complex moral and tactical decision point. Dr. Rasmussen, Wildlife Unit 1 here. Be advised that casualties have been motionless for over 15 minutes. The bear is exhibiting protective behavior and has not responded to previous gunfire. Any delay in securing the scene reduces survival chances for the victims. The radio exchange highlighted the tragic complexity of human-wildlife conflict in the Arctic. Dr. Rasmussen's scientific and conservation perspective clashed with law enforcement's immediate human safety priorities, while neither approach offered guaranteed success. Inside Atlantic Airways Flight 447, the prolonged crisis was creating additional challenges for the flight crew. Captain Sarah Mitchell was monitoring fuel consumption while maintaining communication with emergency coordinators. The aircraft had been prepared for immediate departure when the incident began, and extended ground operations with engines running created both safety and economic concerns. How much longer can we maintain current operations before fuel becomes an issue? She asked First Officer Anderson. We've got approximately 40 minutes of fuel remaining for extended ground operations before we'd need to shut down or refuel, he responded. But passenger welfare is becoming a more immediate concern. The psychological impact of witnessing the attack was manifesting differently among the 127 passengers. Some individuals were becoming increasingly agitated, while others had withdrawn into shocked silence. Flight attendant Elena Rossi was moving through the cabin, trying to provide comfort and maintain order despite her own emotional trauma. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know this situation is extremely difficult," she announced over the intercom. "Emergency services are working to resolve the incident as quickly and safely as possible. Please remain calm and stay in your seats for your safety and the safety of others." Passenger Dr. Marcus Thompson, the marine biologist, was using his scientific background to help explain the situation to nearby passengers. His academic approach provided some stability in an otherwise chaotic emotional environment. "Polar bears are normally solitary and avoid human contact," he explained to a group of frightened passengers. "What we're witnessing is likely the result of environmental pressures forcing this animal out of its normal behavioral patterns." His explanation, while factually accurate, provided little comfort to passengers watching human beings potentially die outside their windows. The intellectual understanding of wildlife behavior offered no emotional buffer against the visceral horror of predator attack. Meanwhile, Dr. Rasmussen's helicopter was attempting to land on the airport tarmac while maintaining sufficient distance from M47 to avoid further agitating the already stressed predator. The approach required exceptional piloting skill in deteriorating weather conditions while coordinating with ground emergency services. Landing zone control. This is Research Helicopter 1. Requesting clearance for immediate landing northwest of the incident scene, her pilot radioed. "Research Helicopter 1, you are cleared to land, but be advised that wind conditions are marginal and the bear may react to aircraft noise," came the response from temporary coordination units established at the scene. The helicopter's arrival marked another critical decision point in the emergency response. Dr. Rasmussen's tranquilizer equipment could potentially immobilize M47 without killing him, but the time required for chemical sedation might be too long for the casualties. Tommy Linger's rifle could instantly neutralize the threat, but would certainly result in the bear's death. As the helicopter touched down, M47 reacted to the additional noise and activity by shifting position slightly, providing Tommy Ling with marginally better shooting angle. The tactical situation remained complex, but the window for action was opening. "Control, this is Wildlife Unit 1, Tommy radioed. "I have a potential shot, but it's not ideal. Request immediate decision on engagement protocol." The request for authorization created a moment of terrible silence on the emergency frequencies. Operations Manager Soren Bjornsson held the authority to make the decision, but the weight of responsibility was enormous. 2 human lives hung in the balance, along with the life of a polar bear whose behavior was shaped by environmental circumstances beyond his control. Dr. Rasmussen was deploying her tranquilizer rifle while coordinating with the tactical teams on the ground. Her equipment could deliver a sedation dose sufficient to immobilize M47 within 3 to 5 minutes. But the chemical agents required precise dosing based on the animal's estimated weight and condition. Wildlife Unit 1, this is Dr. Rasmussen. I need 30 seconds to calculate proper dosing, then I can attempt non-lethal immobilization. The bear appears healthy and approximately 450 kilograms, which gives us good parameters for chemical sedation. The scientific precision of her approach contrasted sharply with the life-or-death urgency of the situation. While Dr. Rasmussen performed calculations, Jonas Peterson and Erik Larsen remained motionless beneath one of the Arctic's most powerful predators. Inside the aircraft, passengers were witnessing the emergency response coordination through the windows while dealing with their own psychological trauma. The sight of multiple emergency vehicles, armed personnel, and a research helicopter created a surreal scene that exceeded anything most travelers could have imagined. Journalist Astrid Sørensen was documenting everything she could observe, understanding that this incident would likely become an international news story, with significant implications for Arctic aviation and wildlife management policies. "This changes everything about polar bear management protocols," she said to her seatmate. "The entire Arctic aviation system will need to reconsider safety procedures." Her professional analysis was correct, though the immediate human cost remained the primary concern for everyone directly involved in the emergency response. On the tarmac, Dr. Rasmussen had completed her dosing calculations and was preparing the tranquilizer rifle. The specialized equipment used powerful compressed gas to deliver sedation darts with sufficient force to penetrate the bear's thick fur and hide, while ensuring proper chemical delivery. "All units, this is Dr. Rasmussen. I'm preparing to engage the bear with tranquilizer. Once delivered, the sedation will take approximately 3 to 5 minutes to take full effect. Be prepared to secure the scene immediately once the animal is immobilized." The tranquilizer approach offered the possibility of saving both human and animal lives, but the time factor remained critical. Every minute that passed reduced the survival chances for Jonas and Erik while increasing the complexity of the medical intervention they would require. Wildlife Officer Tommy Linger acknowledged Dr. Rasmussen's transmission while maintaining his lethal force capability as backup. His tactical position provided overwatch for the tranquilizer attempt while ensuring that any failure could be immediately countered with decisive action. Dr. Rasmussen, Wildlife Unit 1, standing by. You have authorization to attempt non-lethal immobilization. I maintain lethal force backup if the situation deteriorates. The coordinated approach represented the best possible balance between human safety and wildlife conservation, though success remained uncertain given the extreme circumstances. M47, meanwhile, continued to exhibit protective behavior over what he perceived as his prize. The bear's massive form blocked most visual assessment of the casualties, though occasional movements suggested that at least one of the ground crew members might still be alive. Dr. Rasmussen raised the tranquilizer rifle, her years of experience with polar bear research providing the expertise necessary to make the critical shot. The range was approximately 40 meters, well within the effective distance for chemical immobilization, but requiring precise aim to ensure proper dart placement. The sound of the compressed gas system was distinctly different from gunfire, creating a sharp pneumatic pop that carried clearly across the tarmac. The tranquilizer dart struck M47 in the shoulder with perfect accuracy, delivering the carefully calculated dose of immobilizing chemicals into the bear's bloodstream. M47's reaction to the dart impact was immediate and dramatic. The bear spun toward the source of the attack, his massive head swinging to identify this new threat. For several terrifying seconds, it appeared that the tranquilizer might have the opposite of the intended effect, agitating rather than calming the already stressed predator. "Dart deployed successfully, Doctor," Rasmussen radioed. "Beginning countdown for chemical effect. All units maintain safe distance until immobilization is confirmed." The 3 to 5 minute window for chemical sedation felt like hours to everyone involved in the emergency response. Medical teams prepared their equipment while maintaining safe distance. Wildlife officers kept weapons ready for immediate backup, and aircraft passengers watched the drama unfold through their windows with a mixture of hope and terror. Inside the aircraft, the prolonged tension was affecting passengers in various ways. Some individuals were praying, others were filming with their phones, and many were simply staring in stunned silence at a scene that defied normal human experience. Captain Sarah Mitchell was coordinating with airport operations while monitoring her aircraft's systems and passenger welfare. The unprecedented nature of the emergency created challenges that exceeded standard aviation emergency procedures. "Tower, what's our status for potential departure once this situation is resolved?" she asked. "Atlantic Airways 447 will need full runway inspection and clearance before any aircraft movements," Operations Manager Soren Bjornsson responded. "Medical evacuation will require priority access to emergency services. Your departure is indefinitely delayed." The operational implications of the polar bear attack were cascading through Arctic aviation systems. Flight schedules, passenger connections, and cargo deliveries throughout the region would be affected by the closure of Nuuk Airport until normal operations could be restored. On the tarmac, M47 was beginning to show the first effects of chemical sedation. The massive bear's movements were becoming less coordinated, and his aggressive posturing was gradually diminishing as the tranquilizer entered his system. "I'm seeing initial sedation effects," Dr. Rasmussen reported. "The bear's movements are slowing, but full immobilization will require another 2 to 3 minutes. Continue maintaining safe distance." The gradual nature of chemical sedation created ongoing tension for the medical teams waiting to reach the casualties. Every minute of delay reduced survival chances, but approaching too early could trigger a final, potentially fatal attack from a partially sedated but still dangerous predator. Wildlife Officer Tommy Ling was monitoring M47's condition through his rifle scope while coordinating with the medical teams staging nearby. His experience with dangerous wildlife encounters provided crucial tactical assessment of the developing situation. Medical teams. "The bear is showing significant impairment but retains some mobility," he radioed. "I recommend waiting another 90 seconds before attempting casualty approach." The tactical assessment balanced human safety against medical urgency in a calculation that highlighted the unique challenges of emergency response in Arctic environments. Standard urban emergency protocols had no provisions for apex predator encounters during rescue operations. Dr. Malik Peterson, the emergency physician standing by with the medical team, was preparing equipment for the worst-case trauma scenarios that polar bear attacks could create. His medical expertise, combined with limited experience treating animal attack victims, created both competence and apprehension about what they might find. "Based on what we observed, we need to prepare for massive trauma, possible amputations, and severe blood loss," he told his paramedic teams. "The first few minutes of medical intervention will determine survival chances." The clinical preparation for treating polar bear attack victims required psychological as well as medical readiness. The injuries, typically associated with large predator attacks, challenged even experienced trauma physicians and could overwhelm medical personnel unprepared for the severity of damage. Inside the aircraft, passengers were witnessing the final stages of the emergency response with a mixture of relief and continued anxiety. The sight of M47 gradually succumbing to sedation offered hope that the nightmare might finally be ending. But the fate of Jonas Peterson and Erik Larsen remained unknown. Dr. Marcus Thompson was providing commentary that helped some passengers process what they were witnessing while maintaining scientific objectivity about the unfolding crisis. Chemical immobilization is the preferred method for managing dangerous wildlife because it preserves both human and animal life when possible, he explained to nearby passengers. What we're seeing represents the best possible outcome given the circumstances. His academic perspective provided some comfort to passengers struggling to understand how such an incident could occur at a modern airport, though the human cost remained the primary concern for everyone involved. After what felt like an eternity but was actually 4 minutes and 37 seconds, M47 finally succumbed to complete chemical sedation. The massive polar bear, one of the Arctic's most powerful predators, slowly collapsed beside his victims, his breathing deep and regular, but his threat finally neutralized. "Bear is down! Bear is down!" Dr. Rasmussen announced. "Full immobilization achieved. Medical teams are clear to approach the casualties." The moment of triumph was immediately tempered by the grim reality of what the medical teams would find. Jonas Peterson and Erik Larsen had been motionless beneath a 450-kilogram polar bear for over 20 minutes, and the extent of their injuries remained unknown until emergency responders could reach them. Dr. Malik Peterson led the medical team toward the casualties with equipment prepared for the worst possible trauma scenarios. The sight that greeted them exceeded even their pessimistic expectations and would haunt their memories for years to come. Jonas Peterson, the 34-year-old aircraft mechanic and father of 3, had suffered massive trauma to his upper torso and head. The initial impact from M47's charge had broken multiple ribs, punctured both lungs, and caused severe internal bleeding. His condition was critical, but potentially survivable with immediate medical intervention. Erik Larsen, the 41-year-old baggage handler from the Faroe Islands, had sustained even more severe injuries. The polar bear's claws and teeth had caused devastating damage to his neck and chest, resulting in massive blood loss and compromised airways. His survival chances were minimal, even with immediate medical care. "We need immediate helicopter evacuation for both casualties," Dr. Peterson radioed. "Jonas has critical but potentially survivable injuries. Erik's condition is extremely grave. Prepare the hospital for emergency surgery and massive transfusion protocols." The medical assessment launched the next phase of the emergency response as helicopter evacuation was coordinated while ground medical teams provided immediate life support intervention. The specialized equipment and expertise required for treating polar bear attack victims pushed Nuuk Hospital's resources to their limits. Inside the aircraft, passengers were unaware of the specific medical details but could see the urgency of the medical response. The arrival of additional emergency vehicles and the deployment of helicopter evacuation equipment indicated the severity of the situation. Flight attendant Elena Rossi was continuing to manage passenger welfare while dealing with her own psychological trauma from witnessing the attack. Her professional training emphasized remaining calm and supportive, but the extreme circumstances tested every aspect of her crisis management experience. "Ladies and gentlemen, medical teams are now assisting the injured ground crew members," she announced. "We will continue to remain on the aircraft until the situation is fully resolved and normal airport operations can resume." The prolonged nature of the emergency was creating additional stress for passengers who had expected to be in Reykjavik hours earlier. Travel plans connecting flights and business obligations were being disrupted by circumstances no one could have anticipated. Operations manager Soren Bjornsson was coordinating the complex logistics of managing an airport closure while supporting emergency operations and maintaining communication with aviation authorities throughout the region. The incident was already generating international attention that would require careful management. All stations, this is airport operations. The immediate crisis has been resolved, but we remain closed to all traffic until full runway inspection and clearance can be completed. Emergency operations have priority for all airport resources. The operational recovery from a polar bear attack required protocols that had never been tested in real-world conditions. Runway safety inspections needed to account for blood contamination, potential aircraft damage from emergency vehicles, and the ongoing presence of an immobilized but still living polar bear. Dr. Rasmussen was now managing M47's post-sedation care while coordinating with wildlife authorities about the bear's ultimate fate. The attack would require extensive investigation to determine contributing factors and develop improved prevention strategies for future incidents. Wildlife control, this is Dr. Rasmussen. The bear is stable under sedation, but will require decision regarding relocation versus euthanization based on behavioral assessment and public safety considerations. The decision about M47's fate would involve multiple agencies and consideration of factors ranging from public safety to conservation policy. The bear's attack on humans marked him as potentially dangerous, but environmental pressures that contributed to the incident raised questions about culpability and appropriate response. Meanwhile, helicopter evacuation of the casualties was proceeding with the urgency that their conditions demanded. Jonas Peterson was loaded into the first helicopter with medical personnel providing continuous life support during transport to Nuuk Hospital. Erik Larsson's evacuation required additional medical intervention before transport could safely proceed. His injuries were so severe that movement without stabilization could prove fatal, creating another life-or-death decision point for the emergency medical team. Patient 2 requires immediate surgical intervention before transport can be attempted, Dr. Peterson radioed from the tarmac, requesting authorization for emergency field surgery to stabilize airways and control bleeding. The request to perform emergency surgery on an airport tarmac highlighted the extreme nature of the medical crisis. Standard protocols called for rapid transport to hospital facilities, but Erik's condition made transport potentially more dangerous than immediate intervention in suboptimal conditions. Inside the aircraft, passengers were observing the medical evacuation with continued concern and fascination. The sight of emergency surgery being performed on the tarmac exceeded anything most travelers could have imagined when they boarded their routine flight to Iceland. Dr. Thompson was explaining the medical procedures to interested passengers while trying to maintain appropriate sensitivity for the human tragedy they were witnessing. Field surgery in these conditions is extremely challenging, he said. The medical team is performing procedures that would normally require a fully equipped operating room. Their skill and dedication are remarkable. His commentary helped passengers understand the heroic efforts being made to save lives while processing the trauma of witnessing such extreme violence and its aftermath. The emergency surgery on Erik Larsson required 47 minutes of intensive intervention before he could be stabilized sufficiently for helicopter transport. Dr. Peterson's field surgical skills, developed through years of Arctic medicine practice, proved crucial in saving Erik's life during those critical minutes. Patient 2 is stabilized for transport, Dr. Peterson finally announced. Immediate surgical intervention at the hospital will be required, but we've achieved minimum viability for evacuation. The successful stabilization of Erik Larsson represented a triumph of emergency medicine under impossible conditions. However, His long-term survival remained uncertain, and the full extent of his injuries would require extensive hospital evaluation and treatment. Both casualties were eventually evacuated to Nuuk Hospital, where emergency surgical teams had been preparing for the worst possible trauma cases. The hospital's resources were stretched to their limits, but the expertise of Arctic medical professionals proved adequate for the immediate crisis management. With the casualties evacuated and M47 safely immobilized, airport operations could begin the complex process of recovery and investigation. The polar bear attack at Nuuk Airport would require extensive analysis to prevent similar incidents and improve emergency response capabilities. Inside Atlantic Airways Flight 447, Captain Sarah Mitchell was coordinating with airport operations regarding eventual departure clearance while monitoring passenger welfare and aircraft systems. The prolonged ground delay was creating cascading effects throughout the airline's operational network. "Tower, what's our estimated timeline for departure clearance?" she asked. "Atlantic Airways 447, runway inspection and clearance will require approximately 2 hours. Operations Manager Bjornsson responded. "We also need to coordinate with Greenlandic authorities regarding passenger statements for the incident investigation." The administrative aftermath of the polar bear attack would involve multiple agencies and extensive documentation. Passengers who witnessed the incident would be required to provide statements for both aviation safety and wildlife management investigations. Flight attendant Elena Rossi was preparing passengers for the extended delay while managing the psychological aftermath of the trauma they had witnessed. Her crisis management experience was being tested by circumstances that exceeded normal aviation emergency training. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be remaining at Nuuk Airport for several additional hours while authorities complete their investigation and safety inspection," she announced. "Refreshment service will be provided, and we understand this has been an extremely difficult experience for everyone." The passenger response to the extended delay was remarkably patient given the circumstances. The shared trauma of witnessing the polar bear attack had created a sense of community among the travelers that transcended normal airline passenger relationships. Journalist Astrid Sørensen was already composing the story that would bring international attention to the incident within hours. Her professional responsibility to document the tragedy conflicted with the personal trauma of witnessing such extreme violence. "This story changes everything about how we think about Arctic aviation safety," she told her editor via satellite phone. "The implications go far beyond this single incident to fundamental questions about human activity in changing Arctic environments." Her analysis proved prescient, as the story would indeed generate international discussion about climate change, impacts on wildlife behavior, and the safety of human operations in Arctic regions. Dr. Ingrid Rasmussen was beginning the complex process of relocating M47 once the sedation effects began to wear off. The bear's fate remained undetermined, but immediate removal from the airport environment was essential for continued aviation operations. "Wildlife Transport Unit, this is Dr. Rasmussen. Prepare for polar bear relocation approximately 2 hours north of Nuuk. The animal will require monitoring until full recovery from sedation." The relocation of M47 represented a victory for wildlife conservation, though questions about his long-term survival in changing Arctic conditions remained unresolved. The environmental pressures that had brought him into conflict with human activity would continue to affect polar bear populations throughout the region. As afternoon moved toward evening, the immediate crisis had been resolved, but the consequences would reverberate for years to come. Jonas Peterson and Eric Larsen were fighting for their lives in Nuuk Hospital. M47 was being relocated to remote wilderness. and 127 passengers had witnessed one of the most dramatic wildlife encounters in aviation history. The investigation into the polar bear attack would reveal systemic failures in airport wildlife management protocols and highlight the increasing challenges of operating in Arctic environments affected by climate change. The incident would lead to comprehensive revisions of safety procedures at northern airports and increased funding for wildlife conflict prevention programs. Captain Sarah Mitchell finally received departure clearance as darkness fell over Nuuk Airport. Atlantic Airways Flight 447 lifted off into the Arctic night, carrying passengers forever changed by their proximity to the raw power of nature and the fragility of human life in one of the world's most remote and challenging environments. The story of March 3, 2025 would become a defining moment in Arctic aviation history, a tragic reminder of the increasing conflicts between human activity and wildlife behavior in a rapidly changing world. The courage of emergency responders, the skill of medical professionals, and the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances would be remembered long after the immediate trauma faded from public attention. Jonas Peterson survived his injuries after months of recovery and medical treatment, eventually returning to work as an advocate for improved airport wildlife safety protocols. Eric Larsson's survival was considered miraculous by his medical team, though permanent disabilities from his injuries ended his aviation career and required extensive rehabilitation. M47 was successfully relocated, but was found dead 6 months later, apparently from starvation, as changing ice conditions continued to disrupt traditional hunting patterns. His death symbolized the broader environmental challenges facing Arctic wildlife in a warming world. The polar bear attack at Nuuk Airport became a case study in crisis management, wildlife conservation, and the complex interactions between human activity and environmental change in the Arctic. The lessons learned from that terrible day would inform policy decisions and safety protocols for years to come, ensuring that the sacrifices made by all involved would contribute to preventing similar tragedies in the future. The passengers of Atlantic Airways Flight 447 carried their memories of March 3, 2025 for the rest of their lives, forever changed by their witness to the intersection of human ambition and natural power in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. Their collective experience became a testament to human resilience and the enduring challenge of coexisting with the wild forces that continue to shape our planet. The next stories, August 19, 2025. Bear attacks, funeral procession, 2 dead in Alaska cemetery. The morning air hung heavy with the scent of wet pine needles and freshly turned earth as Margaret Rivera adjusted the black lace veil over her salt and pepper hair. At 63, she had attended more funerals than she cared to count, but this one carved a particular hollow in her chest. Her younger brother, Samuel Rivera, had been only 58 when the heart attack claimed him 3 days prior, dropping him in his own driveway as he retrieved the morning paper from the Juneau Empire. The irony wasn't lost on her that Samuel, who had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan and 30 years as a commercial fisherman in the treacherous waters of the Inside Passage, had been felled by something as mundane as clogged arteries and a sedentary retirement. Margaret's weathered hands smoothed the wrinkles from her funeral dress, the same one she'd worn to their mother's service 8 years earlier. The fabric felt heavier now, weighted with accumulated grief. Through the bedroom window of her modest house on Glacier Avenue, she could see the morning fog rolling off the Gastineau Channel, obscuring the lower slopes of Mount Roberts in grey wisps that would burn off by noon. It was going to be a beautiful day, the kind Samuel would have spent on his boat, the Lucky Strike, casting lines into the silver waters and telling the same stories about the one that got away. The Evergreen Memorial Cemetery sat on a gentle rise overlooking the channel, established in 1887 during Juneau's gold rush days. Its wrought iron gates, now showing the patina of more than a century of southeast Alaska weather, opened onto winding gravel paths that meandered between weathered headstones and towering Sitka spruce trees. The cemetery had been carved from the original forest, leaving ancient trees standing as silent sentinels among the graves. Some of these giants had witnessed the burial of gold miners, fishermen, loggers, and the families who had made Juneau their home generation after generation. Thomas Rivera, Margaret's nephew and Samuel's eldest son, had arrived from Anchorage the previous evening. At 34, Thomas possessed his father's broad shoulders and steady hands, though he'd traded the fishing life for an office job with the State Environmental Protection Agency. His wife, Jennifer, a slender woman with intelligent green eyes, worked as a nurse at Providence, Alaska Medical Center. They'd driven the 570 miles from Anchorage in their Subaru Outback, the back seat packed with funeral clothes, and their two young daughters, 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Sophie, who didn't fully understand why Grandpa Sam wouldn't be taking them fishing anymore. Thomas stood in his childhood bedroom, now converted to his mother's sewing room, knotting a black tie with fingers that trembled slightly. The room still smelled faintly of the Old Spice aftershave his father had worn, and family photos lined the dresser. Samuel in his army uniform, Samuel on his wedding day, Samuel holding newborn Thomas, Samuel teaching his granddaughters to bait hooks. Each image captured the essence of a man who had lived fully and loved deeply, making his sudden departure all the more devastating. "You okay, honey?" Jennifer's voice carried from the hallway where she was helping the girls get ready. Her nursing background had taught her to read the signs of grief, and she recognized the hollow look in her husband's eyes. "Yeah," Thomas replied, though his voice caught slightly. "Just thinking about the last time Dad and I talked. It was about the salmon run on the Mendenhall. He wanted to take the girls out there next weekend." He paused, swallowing hard. "Guess that won't be happening." Down the hall, Emma Rivera carefully buttoned the black dress her mother had bought for the occasion. At 8, she understood death in the abstract way children do. Grandpa Sam was gone and wouldn't be coming back, like their cat Whiskers, who had died the previous winter. But the finality of it hadn't truly settled in her young mind. She was more concerned about whether she'd have to throw dirt on the coffin like she'd seen in movies, and whether it would hurt Grandpa Sam, even though everyone assured her he couldn't feel anything anymore. Sophie, 3 years younger, sat on the bed watching her sister with wide blue eyes. She clutched a small photograph of Samuel that she'd insisted on bringing, showing him holding her on his boat during their last fishing trip. In the picture, both of them were grinning widely, Samuel's weathered hands steady on the wheel, while Sophie pointed excitedly at something in the water. The memory of that day, the sound of the engine, the smell of salt air, the feeling of being safe in her grandfather's arms, was beginning to feel dreamlike, too perfect to have been real. Across town, Mariah Cole was having her own struggle with funeral preparation. At 29, Mariah was Samuel's niece through marriage, the daughter of his wife's sister. She had moved to Juneau 5 years earlier from Seattle, drawn by the promise of adventure and a job with the Forest Service. Her apartment on Franklin Street, a converted storefront in the historic district, reflected her love of the outdoors, with climbing gear hanging from hooks, topographic maps covering one wall, and a collection of pressed wildflowers arranged in frames. Mariah had inherited her mother's auburn hair and her father's stubborn chin, along with an independent spirit that had carried her through forestry school and into a career tracking wildlife populations in the Tongass National Forest. She knew the backcountry around Juneau like few others, having spent countless hours hiking trails, setting up camera traps, and documenting the movements of brown bears, black bears, wolves, and other wildlife. Her work had taught her to read the signs of animal presence, the claw marks on trees, the shape and age of scat. the pattern of tracks in mud or snow. That morning, as she searched through her closet for appropriate funeral attire, Mariah's mind kept wandering to a conversation she'd had with Samuel just 2 weeks earlier. They'd been at a family barbecue, and he'd mentioned seeing a large brown bear near the cemetery during one of his evening walks. Samuel had been concerned because the bear seemed unafraid of human presence, lingering near the maintenance shed and showing signs of food conditioning. "You should report that to Fish and Game," Mariah had told him. But Samuel had waved off her concern with typical stubbornness. "It's just one bear," he'd said, "probably just passing through. No need to get the government involved." Now, pulling a black blazer from its hanger, Mariah felt a twinge of regret. She should have insisted more forcefully, should have made the report herself. Her training had taught her that food-conditioned bears were dangerous bears, and a bear comfortable around humans was a bear that might see humans as either a threat to be eliminated or a source of food. She made a mental note to check with the cemetery maintenance staff about any recent bear activity after the service. The drive to the cemetery took the Rivera family through downtown Juneau, past the state capitol building and the cruise ship docks where tourists were already beginning to disembark for their day of sightseeing. The contrast between their black funeral attire and the brightly colored vacation clothes of the tourists felt jarring, as if they were occupying two different worlds that briefly intersected on the same streets. Thomas drove slowly, partly out of respect for the occasion and partly because he dreaded the finality of what lay ahead. In the rearview mirror, he could see his daughters fidgeting in their car seats, Emma reading a book about dolphins, while Sophie colored in a princess coloring book. Jennifer sat beside him, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand when she noticed his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Remember what we talked about," Jennifer said softly, her voice barely audible over the classic rock station playing quietly on the radio. "You don't have to be strong for everyone today. It's okay to grieve." Thomas nodded, but didn't trust his voice to respond. His father had taught him that men were supposed to be strong, supposed to provide stability for their families, supposed to handle whatever life threw at them without complaint. But sitting in the driver's seat of his Subaru, following a hearse carrying his father's body to its final resting place, those lessons felt inadequate to the weight of his loss. The cemetery gates came into view as they rounded the curve on Egan Drive. The wrought iron entrance stood open, flanked by stone pillars topped with carved eagles. A small sign announced visiting hours and reminded visitors that the cemetery closed at dusk. Beyond the gates, the winding gravel paths led past sections designated by era. The original miners' section with its weathered wooden crosses, the main section with traditional headstones, and the newer area where Samuel would be laid to rest, among more recent arrivals to the eternal community. Margaret Rivera had arrived early, her sister-in-law Eleanor beside her for support. Eleanor, Samuel's wife of 36 years, moved through the morning with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. She'd handled all the funeral arrangements with characteristic efficiency, selecting the casket, arranging for flowers, coordinating with the pastor. But her eyes held the hollow distance of someone not quite present in her own life. "He would have liked this spot," Elena said, standing beside the freshly dug grave. The plot sat beneath a towering Sitka spruce, with a view of the channel visible between the trees. "Remember how he used to sit on the porch and watch the boats go by? He'll have a good view here." Margaret nodded, though privately she thought it morbid to speak of the dead, as if they could still appreciate scenic vistas. But grief made people say strange things, and she'd learned over the years that comfort came in many forms. If Elena found peace in the idea that Samuel would enjoy his eternal view, then Margaret would support that belief. Other family members began to arrive as the morning progressed. Samuel's brother Robert drove down from Skagway with his wife and 2 teenage sons. Samuel's fishing buddies, Weathered men in ill-fitting suits who looked more comfortable in rain gear and work boots gathered near the entrance, sharing quiet stories about Samuel's generosity and his legendary ability to find fish when others came home empty-handed. Pastor Williams from the First Presbyterian Church arrived at 10:30, carrying his worn Bible and a folder of notes about Samuel's life. He'd visited with the family twice since Samuel's death, gathering stories and memories to weave into the service. Samuel hadn't been a regular churchgoer, but he'd been a good man who'd helped his neighbors, provided for his family, and treated others with respect. That was the kind of faith Pastor Williams believed mattered most. The funeral director, Harold Mackenzie, supervised the final preparations with practiced efficiency. At 71, Harold had been conducting funerals in Juneau for more than 4 decades. He'd buried gold miners and governors, fishermen and shop owners, children and centenarians. Each service required the same attention to detail, the same careful choreography of grief and remembrance. Harold's assistant, a young man named David Chen, helped arrange the folding chairs and position the portable podium. By 11:15, more than 60 people had gathered at the graveside. The morning fog had lifted as predicted, revealing a clear blue sky crossed by high cirrus clouds. The temperature hovered in the low 60s, comfortable for standing outdoors, but cool enough that older mourners pulled their sweaters tighter. A gentle breeze carried the scent of spruce needles and wildflowers from the forest beyond the cemetery boundaries. Mariah Cole arrived with her supervisor from the Forest Service, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who had known Samuel through his volunteer work with the local fishing conservation group. Patricia was a small woman with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to working in challenging environments. Her eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, constantly scanned their surroundings with the trained observation skills of a wildlife biologist. "Beautiful spot," Patricia murmured to Mariah as they found seats in the back row. Samuel would have appreciated being laid to rest in the forest. Mariah nodded, but she was distracted by something she'd noticed near the tree line. A section of underbrush about 50 yards away showed signs of recent disturbance. Broken branches and what looked like a well-used game trail leading into the deeper woods. Her professional eye automatically catalogued the details: the height of the broken branches, the width of the path, the pattern of tracks in the soft earth. Everything pointed to large animal activity, and in southeast Alaska, that meant bears. She was about to mention it to Patricia when Pastor Williams stepped to the podium and called for attention. "Friends, family, we gather today not just to mourn the passing of Samuel Rivera, but to celebrate a life well lived and deeply cherished." The service began with a hymn, "Amazing Grace," sung by the gathered mourners with varying degrees of musical ability. Elena's voice wavered on the familiar words, while Thomas stood silent, unable to trust his voice. Emma and Sophie fidgeted in their chairs, occasionally whispering questions to their mother about when they could go home. Pastor Williams spoke about Samuel's service to his country, his dedication to his family, and his love of the sea. He read passages from Ecclesiastes about there being a time for every purpose under heaven, including a time to be born and a time to die. The words offered little comfort to those who felt Samuel's time had come too soon, but they provided a familiar structure to help navigate the choppy waters of grief. As the pastor spoke, a raven landed on a nearby headstone and cocked its head as if listening to the service. In southeast Alaska, ravens were considered both scavengers and symbols of wisdom, and several mourners took note of the bird's presence. Samuel had always enjoyed watching ravens, fascinated by their intelligence and their complex social behaviors. The eulogy portion of the service invited family members to share memories. Thomas stood first, his hand shaking as he unfolded a sheet of paper with notes he'd written the night before. My father taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he accumulates, but by how he treats others and what he leaves behind. He taught me to fish, to work with my hands, to keep my word, and to take care of my family. He left behind a legacy of love, integrity, and service that I hope to honor every day. Robert, Samuel's brother, spoke about their childhood adventures in the woods around Juneau, back when the town was smaller and wilder. Sam was always the brave one, he said with a slight smile. He'd be the first to climb the highest tree, the first to jump off the pier into the cold water, the first to stand up to bullies. That courage served him well in the army and in life. Elena had planned to speak, but when her moment came, she simply shook her head and gestured for the service to continue. Margaret understood. Sometimes grief was too fresh, too raw for public expression. There would be time later for Elena to say her goodbyes in private. The raven on the headstone suddenly took flight, its wings catching the breeze as it soared toward the forest. Several mourners watched its departure, and in that moment of upward gazing, nobody noticed the large shape moving through the trees at the forest edge. At 12:47 p.m., as Pastor Williams was leading the group in the Lord's Prayer, the first sign of trouble came from an unexpected direction. David Chen, the funeral director's assistant, was standing near the maintenance shed when he noticed fresh bear scat near the building. The scat was large, dark, and still moist, indicating a recent deposit. David had grown up in Juneau and knew enough about bear safety to recognize a potential problem. He quietly approached Harold Mackenzie and whispered in his ear. Harold's expression shifted from practiced solemnity to concern as he glanced toward the forest. As someone who'd worked in Alaska cemeteries for decades, Harold had dealt with wildlife encounters before, though usually involving smaller animals like ravens or squirrels attracted to flowers left at graves. "Should we say something?" David whispered. Harold looked at the gathered mourners, heads bowed in prayer, and made a calculation. The service was nearly over. The burial would take only a few more minutes, and causing a panic might be worse than letting sleeping bears lie. "Let's wait and see," he decided. "Keep an eye on the tree line." But Harold's decision was made too late. Even as David scanned the forest edge, a massive coastal brown bear emerged from the underbrush, approximately 75 yards from the assembled mourners. The bear stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder when walking on all fours, with the distinctive shoulder hump and dished face profile characteristic of its species. Its dark brown coat showed the silver-tipped guard hairs that caught the afternoon sunlight, and its small, intelligent eyes surveyed the human gathering with an expression that mixed curiosity and calculation. This particular bear, later identified by wildlife authorities as a mature male weighing approximately 850 pounds, had been frequenting the cemetery area for several weeks. Human activity around the maintenance shed, including improperly secured garbage and food waste left by visitors, had created what wildlife biologists call a food conditioning situation. The bear had learned to associate human presence with potential food sources, a dangerous development that should have triggered immediate intervention by wildlife management authorities. Mariah Cole spotted the bear first, her trained eye immediately recognizing both the species and the potential threat level. A coastal brown bear approaching a group of humans in daylight represented a serious safety concern, particularly one showing no apparent fear of human presence. She rose slowly from her chair, her movement calculated to avoid sudden gestures that might startle the animal. "Patricia," she whispered urgently to her supervisor. "Bear. 2 o'clock. Large male." Dr. Hendricks followed Mariah's gaze and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. As a wildlife biologist with 25 years of experience, she'd seen the results of human-bear encounters gone wrong. A bear comfortable enough to approach a large group of humans was a bear that had likely lost its natural wariness, making it unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The bear continued its approach, moving with the deceptively casual gait that could explode into a 30-mile-per-hour charge with virtually no warning. It paused occasionally to sniff the air, processing the complex scent tableau of flowers, human bodies, cologne, perfume, and the disturbed earth of the gravesite. Pastor Williams, still leading the prayer, remained unaware of the developing situation. His eyes were closed, his voice carrying the familiar rhythm of words he'd spoken at countless gravesides. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thomas Rivera opened his eyes during the prayer and immediately saw the bear. His breath caught in his throat as his mind processed the size of the animal and its proximity to his family. His daughters, Emma and Sophie, sat just 10 feet away, their heads bowed in mimicry of the adults around them. Every instinct screamed at him to grab his children and run, but his limited knowledge of bear safety suggested that running might trigger a chase response. Jennifer, he whispered as quietly as possible. Bear behind you. Don't turn around. Don't run. Jennifer's nursing training had taught her to remain calm in crisis situations, and she forced herself to keep her head down and her breathing steady. How close, she whispered back. Too close. The bear had now approached to within 40 yards of the outer edge of mourners. Its massive head swung slowly from side to side as it assessed the situation, nostrils flaring to process the wealth of scent information. To the untrained observer, the bear might have appeared curious or even peaceful, but wildlife experts would later note several concerning behavioral indicators. The direct approach rather than avoidance, the lack of apparent fear despite the large human gathering, and most troubling, the focused attention on specific individuals. Harold Mackenzie finally spotted the animal and felt his stomach drop. In 43 years of conducting funeral services, he'd dealt with rain, snow, wind, and even a small earthquake, but never a situation like this. His mind raced through options. Attempt to quietly evacuate the group, try to scare off the bear, or simply hope it would lose interest and wander away. Margaret Rivera noticed the sudden tension in the people around her. Harold's assistant was making subtle hand gestures. Mariah Cole was slowly reaching into her jacket pocket, and her nephew Thomas had gone rigid in his chair. She turned slightly and saw the bear, now close enough that she could make out individual details. The massive claws, the intelligent brown eyes, the sheer bulk of muscle and bone that represented 800 pounds of predator. Dear God, she breathed, the words barely audible. Elena Rivera, lost in her own grief, continued to keep her head bowed. She was thinking about Samuel, about their last conversation, about all the things left unsaid. The presence of danger hadn't yet registered in her consciousness. The bear stopped at 30 yards, just at the edge of what wildlife experts consider the critical distance, the point at which a bear encounter transforms from a wildlife sighting to a genuine emergency. It sat back on its haunches, a position that might have appeared relaxed, but actually provided the perfect launching point for a charge. Dr. Hendricks slowly reached into her field jacket and retrieved a small air horn, standard equipment for anyone working in bear country. She knew that the noise might startle the animal into leaving, but it could just as easily provoke an aggressive response. The decision to use it would depend on the bear's behavior over the next few crucial moments. Pastor Williams finally became aware that something was amiss when he noticed the change in his congregation's posture. Heads that had been bowed in prayer were now raised and turned toward the forest. Bodies that had been relaxed in grief were now tense with fear. He looked around, confused, until he followed their collective gaze and saw the massive brown bear sitting at the edge of the cemetery, The pastor's first thought was surprisingly practical. He'd never dealt with a bear encounter in seminary. His second thought was a prayer, not the formal kind he'd been leading, but the desperate, wordless plea of someone facing a situation beyond his control. "Stay calm," Mariah Cole said, in a voice that carried just loud enough for nearby mourners to hear. "Nobody run. Nobody make sudden movements. Bears can outrun horses." But even as she spoke, the bear's behavior was shifting in a direction that made her heart race. Instead of showing the typical signs of a bear that might be encouraged to leave, swaying, jaw popping, huffing, this animal displayed the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential prey or a territorial threat assessing potential rivals. The bear rose to its hind legs, a position that allowed it to better evaluate the human gathering. Standing upright, it towered nearly 8 feet tall, its massive frame blotting out a section of the forest behind it. This behavior, while often misinterpreted as aggression, was actually information gathering. The bear was using its elevated position to better see and smell the assembled humans. Thomas Rivera made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Seeing his daughters still seated and vulnerable, he quietly rose from his chair and began moving toward them. His plan was simple: position himself between his family and the bear, then slowly guide them toward the cars parked near the cemetery entrance. The movement caught the bear's attention immediately. The massive head swiveled toward Thomas, and the small, intelligent eyes fixed on him with laser focus. In that moment, the dynamic changed. What had been a curious investigation became a direct confrontation between a protective father and a potentially dangerous predator. "Thomas, don't move," Mariah called softly, but it was too late. The bear dropped to all fours and took several steps toward the human who had dared to move in its presence. Jennifer grabbed both of her daughter's hands, her nursing instincts taking over. "Girls, we're going to play a game," she said in the calmest voice she could manage. "We're going to sit very, very still and be very, very quiet, just like statues." Emma, at 8, was old enough to sense the fear in her mother's voice, despite her attempt at playfulness. She looked around and saw the bear, her young mind struggling to process the size and proximity of the animal. Sophie, 3 years younger, was more focused on the strange tension in the adults around her than the source of their fear. The bear continued its approach toward Thomas, who stood frozen in a half-crouch between his chair and his family. Every instinct told him to run, to put distance between himself and the predator. But Mariah's words echoed in his mind. Bears can outrun horses. He forced himself to remain still, hoping the animal would lose interest and wander away. At 20 yards, the bear paused again, its massive head lowered toward the ground, nostrils working to process the scent trail. What it found there was deeply concerning to the wildlife experts who would later reconstruct the encounter, evidence of food conditioning. The bear was following scent markers that suggested previous successful foraging in the area, possibly remnants of food left by cemetery visitors or workers. Harold Mackenzie made a decision that probably saved lives. He began slowly backing toward his hearse, reaching for the vehicle's horn. If he could reach the car and sound a loud, sustained blast, it might startle the bear into retreating. The risk was that it might also provoke an attack, but doing nothing seemed equally dangerous. The bear noticed Harold's movement and swung its head toward the funeral director. For a moment, its attention was divided between Thomas, who remained frozen in place, and Harold, who was slowly backing toward his vehicle. In that instant of divided attention, several things happened almost simultaneously. Elena Rivera finally looked up and saw the bear. Her grief-numbed mind struggled to process this new reality, and she let out a sharp gasp of surprise and fear. The sound, while not particularly loud, was unexpected and drew the bear's attention back toward the main group of mourners. Mariah Cole decided to act. She slowly withdrew a small canister of bear spray from her jacket pocket, standard equipment for her field work. Bear spray, a concentrated form of pepper spray designed specifically for deterring bear attacks, was effective at ranges up to 30 feet. The bear was now close enough to be within range, but using the spray risked provoking an attack if it failed to deter the animal. Dr. Hendricks gripped her air horn tighter, her finger positioned over the activation button. Her experience told her that the situation was rapidly deteriorating, that the bear's body language was shifting from curious to potentially aggressive. The question was whether to act preemptively or wait for a clear threat. Pastor Williams found himself in a situation he'd never imagined, leading a flock through a crisis that had nothing to do with matters of faith and everything to do with immediate physical danger. He began backing slowly toward the podium, thinking he might use it as a barrier between himself and the bear. The bear made the decision for all of them. Something in the complex mixture of scents, sounds, and movements triggered a response that transformed the curious animal into a threat. Wildlife behaviorists would later debate whether it was territorial aggression, food-seeking behavior, or simple startlement. But in the moment, the bear's intent became unmistakably hostile. The massive animal began what experts call a bluff charge, a rapid advance intended to test the human's response. It covered the first 10 yards in less than 2 seconds, its powerful legs driving it forward with frightening speed. The sight of 850 pounds of brown bear charging toward them broke the resolve of several mourners who scattered in different directions despite earlier warnings not to run. Thomas Rivera, seeing the bear bearing down on his general area, abandoned caution and threw himself toward his daughters. His movement from frozen statue to rapid motion seemed to focus the bear's attention directly on him. The animal veered slightly to pursue this moving target, closing the distance with each powerful stride. "Thomas!" Jennifer screamed, her voice cutting through the afternoon air. Mariah Cole deployed her bear spray, sending an orange-tinted cloud of pepper spray toward the charging animal. At 20 feet, she was within the effective range of the spray. But the bear's momentum and the outdoor setting limited its effectiveness. The spray cloud caught the bear's attention and caused it to slow momentarily, but didn't stop its forward progress. Dr. Hendricks activated her air horn, sending a piercing blast across the cemetery. The sudden, loud noise caused several mourners to jump and cry out, but it had little effect on the bear, which had apparently become habituated to various human sounds during its weeks of cemetery visits. Harold Mackenzie reached his hearse and began honking the horn in sustained blasts, adding to the cacophony of noise. The combination of air horn, car horn, shouting humans, and pepper spray created a chaotic sensory environment, but the bear continued its charge. Thomas Rivera had covered half the distance to his daughters when the bear reached him. The impact was devastating. 850 pounds of muscle and bone collided with a 180-pound man, sending Thomas flying backward into a row of folding chairs. The metal chairs collapsed under his weight, creating a tangle of aluminum and fabric that briefly confused both man and bear. The bear, momentarily disoriented by the collision and the obstacles, paused for perhaps 2 seconds. In those crucial moments, Jennifer Rivera scooped up both daughters and began running toward the parked cars, her nursing background forgotten in the face of maternal instinct. Emma screamed as her mother carried her, while Sophie clung to her mother's neck in terrified silence. Margaret Rivera, despite her 63 years, proved surprisingly agile as she dodged between headstones toward the cemetery entrance. Her mind flashed back to stories her grandfather had told about bears in the mining camps, and she remembered his advice. Make yourself small, protect your vital organs, play dead if attacked. But Thomas Rivera, dazed from his collision with the bear and tangled in collapsed chairs, couldn't follow any survival strategy. The bear, recovering from its own momentary confusion, focused on the humans struggling on the ground before it. What happened next would be seared into the memories of every witness present. The bear reared up on its hind legs and came down with both front paws on Thomas's chest. The force drove the air from his lungs and likely cracked several ribs. Thomas tried to roll away, but the bear's weight pinned him partially to the ground. The animal's massive head came down toward Thomas's face, and he instinctively threw his arms up to protect himself. The bear's jaws closed on Thomas's left forearm, its teeth designed for crushing salmon bones, having no trouble penetrating human flesh. Thomas's scream cut across the cemetery, a sound of agony and terror that several witnesses would later describe as the worst sound they'd ever heard. Mariah Cole, still holding her now empty bear spray canister, looked around desperately for another weapon. She grabbed a folding chair and began striking the bear's hindquarters, hoping to distract it from Thomas. The metal chair made solid contact, but barely registered with an animal accustomed to fighting other bears and dealing with much more serious threats. Robert Rivera, Samuel's brother, had been moving toward his truck when the attack began. Now he reversed direction, running back toward the scene with a tire iron in his hand. At 55, Robert was no match for a brown bear in physical combat, but he couldn't stand by and watch his nephew be mauled to death. The bear released Thomas's arm and turned toward these new threats. Its face was now marked with Thomas's blood, and its eyes held the focused intensity of a predator fully committed to a fight. The massive animal seemed to have grown even larger, its fur standing on end and its shoulder muscles bunched for another attack. Thomas rolled toward a nearby headstone, trying to put solid granite between himself and the bear. His left arm was mangled and bleeding heavily, but adrenaline allowed him to keep moving. He could hear Jennifer screaming his name from somewhere near the cars, could hear Emma crying for her daddy, could hear the chaos of panicked mourners fleeing in all directions. The bear swatted at Mariah's chair with one massive paw, sending both the chair and the woman flying in different directions. Mariah landed hard against a headstone, her shoulder blade taking most of the impact. The pain was immediate and severe, but she forced herself to keep moving, crawling behind the monument for protection. Robert Rivera reached the scene just as the bear turned its attention to him. The tire iron in his hands suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate against 850 pounds of angry predator. The bear charged again, this time covering the 8 feet between them in a single bound. Robert swung the tire iron with all his strength, catching the bear across the snout. The metal tool left a gash on the animal's face, but the blow only seemed to enrage it further. The bear's right paw swept across Robert's chest, its claws leaving 5 parallel wounds from his shoulder to his sternum. Robert stumbled backward, blood immediately soaking through his funeral shirt. Pastor Williams, who had taken refuge behind his podium, began reciting the 23rd Psalm in a voice loud enough to be heard over the chaos. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Whether he was trying to comfort himself, the other survivors, or the dying, no one would ever know. The bear seemed momentarily confused by the presence of multiple potential threats and victims. It turned in a circle, blood from Robert's tire iron strike dripping from its snout, trying to assess which human posed the greatest danger or offered the best target. This moment of indecision proved crucial for the next phase of the attack. Mariah Cole had managed to crawl behind a large family monument, a granite structure that provided substantial cover. From her hiding place, she could see Thomas Rivera trying to drag himself away from the immediate area, leaving a trail of blood behind him. She could see Robert Rivera staggering but still on his feet, the tire iron still clutched in his hands. And she could see the bear, magnificent and terrible, standing in the middle of a cemetery that had suddenly become a killing ground. Her training as a wildlife biologist kicked in, even as her human heart pounded with terror. She began looking for patterns in the bear's behavior, trying to predict its next move. The animal was clearly agitated and stressed, but it wasn't displaying the continuous aggression of a bear defending cubs or territory. This seemed more like a food-conditioned bear that had been surprised or threatened by the large gathering of humans. The knowledge didn't make the situation any less dangerous, but it gave Mariah hope that the bear might eventually disengage if given the opportunity. The key was to avoid further provoking it while protecting the injured and allowing others to escape. But even as she was thinking through survival strategies, the situation deteriorated further. Elena Rivera, Samuel's widow, had remained frozen in her chair throughout the initial attack. Grief and shock had left her unable to process the danger, unable to run when others fled. Now, as the bear's attention swept across the cemetery, its gaze fixed on her motionless figure. To the bear, Elena's stillness might have represented several things: a potential threat playing dead, a wounded animal unable to flee, or simply another target in an area it was now defending. Whatever its reasoning, the massive predator began moving toward the grieving widow with the same purposeful stride that had preceded its attack on Thomas. Margaret Rivera, who had reached the relative safety of the cemetery entrance, saw her sister-in-law's peril and faced an impossible choice. She could continue fleeing to safety, or she could try to help Elena, risking her own life in the process. The decision took less than a second. "Elena!" Margaret shouted, running back into the cemetery. "Elena, run!" Her voice seemed to snap Elena out of her shocked paralysis. The widow looked up to see the bear approaching, its blood-stained muzzle and intense gaze, making its intentions clear. Elena tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Fear and grief had left her weak, and she stumbled as she tried to flee. The bear, seeing Elena's movement, accelerated its approach. Margaret Rivera, running with a speed that surprised her, reached her sister-in-law just as the bear closed the distance. Margaret threw her arms around Elena, trying to drag her away from the approaching predator. But both women were in their 60s and no match for the bear's speed. The bear reached them just as they began to move. Its massive paw struck Margaret first, sending her tumbling away from Elena. Margaret's last coherent thought was surprise at how much it hurt, how the bear's claws felt like being struck by 5 simultaneous knives. She hit the ground hard and lay still. Elena, now alone and directly in the bear's path, did the only thing her terrified mind could think of. She covered her head with her arms and began to pray. The bear loomed over her, its massive bulk blocking out the sun, its breath hot on her neck. What happened next would be debated by wildlife experts and traumatize the surviving witnesses for years to come. The bear, instead of immediately attacking Elena, began what appeared to be an investigation. It sniffed around the prostrate woman, occasionally nudging her with its nose or pawing gently at her clothes. Some experts would later suggest that Elena's complete stillness and submission triggered the bear's natural response to a non-threatening presence. Others would argue that the animal was simply confused by the chaotic situation and the multiple scents and sounds. Whatever the reason, Elena Rivera lay motionless under the bear's investigation, certain that each breath would be her last. Thomas Rivera, despite his injuries, had managed to crawl behind a large headstone. From his hiding place, he could see his Aunt Elena under the bear's attention, could see his Uncle Robert bleeding but still standing, could see the general chaos that had erupted in what was supposed to be his father's final farewell. The irony was not lost on him that Samuel Rivera's funeral had become the site of a life-and-death struggle that would define his family forever. The sound of sirens in the distance provided the first hope that help was coming. Someone, probably multiple people, had called 911, and the Juneau Police Department was responding. But Thomas knew enough about emergency response times to realize that help was still several minutes away, and several minutes was an eternity when facing a brown bear attack. Harold Mackenzie had continued honking his car horn throughout the attack, adding to the cacophony of noise that filled the cemetery. His assistant, David Chen, had called 911 on his cell phone and was now trying to coordinate the evacuation of surviving mourners while staying clear of the immediate danger area. "Police and ambulance are en route," David called out to anyone who could hear him. "If you can move, get to the cars. If you're injured, stay down and stay quiet." Jennifer Rivera had reached her car with both daughters and was faced with an agonizing decision: drive away to safety or stay and try to help her badly injured husband. Emma and Sophie were crying in the back seat, traumatized by the violence they'd witnessed and terrified for their father's safety. "Mommy, we have to help Daddy," Emma sobbed. "The bear is hurting Daddy." Jennifer's training as a nurse told her that Thomas needed immediate medical attention, that the wounds she'd seen on his arm looked severe, possibly life-threatening, but her instincts as a mother demanded that she protect her children above all else. The decision tore at her heart, but she made the choice that medical professionals are trained to make in triage situations: save who you can save. "Daddy's going to be okay," she told her daughters, starting the car. "We're going to drive to where we can get help for him." But even as she spoke the words, Jennifer wasn't sure she believed them. The image of her husband being mauled by 850 pounds of brown bear was seared into her memory, and the amount of blood she'd seen didn't suggest a survivable injury. Dr. Patricia Hendricks had taken refuge behind a maintenance shed and was using her cell phone to contact Alaska Fish and Game directly. As a federal wildlife biologist, she had direct numbers for state wildlife enforcement officers and knew that a bear attack required specialized response teams. "This is Dr. Patricia Hendricks with the Forest Service," she told the dispatcher. "We have an active brown bear attack at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. Multiple casualties. The animal is still on scene and still aggressive. We need wildlife enforcement and medical response immediately." The dispatcher confirmed that police and ambulances were already en route. But Dr. Hendricks knew that first responders might not be adequately equipped to deal with a large, aggressive brown bear. Standard police weapons were often insufficient against such animals, and approaching the scene without proper training could result in additional casualties. From her hiding place behind the maintenance shed, Dr. Hendricks could see Elena Rivera still lying motionless beneath the bear's investigation. She could see Thomas Rivera behind his headstone, could see Margaret Rivera lying still where she'd fallen, could see Robert Rivera still standing, but clearly wounded. The bear seemed to be losing interest in Elena, who had remained perfectly still throughout the ordeal. It lifted its massive head and surveyed the cemetery, perhaps beginning to realize that the initial threat, whatever it had perceived as threatening, was no longer present. Most of the humans had fled or were hiding, the loud noises had stopped, and the situation was settling into an uneasy calm. Mariah Cole, still hidden behind her granite monument, recognized this shift in the bear's behavior. Her wildlife training suggested that the animal might now be looking for an opportunity to disengage and leave the area. The key was to avoid doing anything that might re-trigger its aggressive response. But even as she was thinking this, the situation took another turn. The sirens, which had been growing steadily louder, were now very close. The first police car was approaching the cemetery entrance, and the bear could undoubtedly hear the unfamiliar sounds. Officer Sarah Martinez was the first law enforcement officer to arrive at the scene. A 12-year veteran of the Juneau Police Department, she had dealt with various wildlife encounters, but never an active bear attack with multiple casualties. Her police academy training had covered bear safety, but the reality of facing 850 pounds of predator was far different from classroom instruction. Martinez parked her patrol car at the cemetery entrance and immediately called for additional units and medical support. Through her windshield, she could see the chaotic aftermath of the attack: overturned chairs, people hiding behind headstones and monuments, and a massive brown bear standing in the middle of it all. Her department-issued sidearm, a .40 caliber pistol, was not ideal for stopping a large bear, but it was what she had available. Martinez had heard the stories of other officers who had been forced to shoot bears in defense of human life, and she knew that proper shot placement was crucial. A wounded bear was often more dangerous than an unwounded one. The bear noticed the police car and turned its attention toward this new arrival. Officer Martinez could see that the animal's face was stained with blood, confirming that at least one person had been seriously injured. She could also see several people who appeared to be hiding or wounded throughout the cemetery grounds. Martinez activated her radio. "Control, Unit 23, on scene at Evergreen Cemetery. Confirm multiple casualties from brown bear attack. Animal is still active on scene. Requesting additional units, medical response, and fish and game backup immediately." The radio crackled back. "Unit 23, additional units and medical are en route. Fish and game has been notified. Use extreme caution." As if sensing the arrival of a new threat, the bear began moving away from Elena Rivera and toward the cemetery entrance. Its gait was purposeful, but not yet aggressive, suggesting that it might be looking for an escape route rather than preparing for another attack. This presented Officer Martinez with a tactical dilemma: allow the bear to potentially escape past her position, possibly endangering other civilians outside the cemetery, or attempt to contain it within the cemetery grounds, where injured people were still at risk. Thomas Rivera watched the bear's movement from his hiding place behind the headstone. His left arm was severely damaged and bleeding heavily, but he was conscious and alert. He could see the police car at the entrance and realized that the officer inside was facing the same bear that had just mauled him and his uncle. "Officer!" he called out, his voice carrying across the cemetery. "There are injured people here. We need medical help." Officer Martinez heard the call and immediately understood that this was not a situation where she could simply wait for backup. People were bleeding and possibly dying while she sat in her patrol car. She made a decision that would later be reviewed and ultimately praised by her department. She got out of her car to begin evacuating casualties. The bear, seeing this new human emerge from the strange metal object, stopped its movement toward the entrance. Once again, its attention was focused on a potential threat or target. Martinez could see the animal's ears flatten against its head, a sign of aggression she remembered from her training. "Stay in your car," Dr. Hendricks called from behind the maintenance shed. "The animal is still aggressive." But Martinez had already committed to her course of action. She began moving slowly along the cemetery's main path, her weapon drawn but pointed downward, trying to reach the nearest injured person while keeping the bear in sight. The bear made a decision that changed everything. Instead of continuing toward the entrance or remaining in place, it charged directly at Officer Martinez. 850 pounds of brown bear covered the 30 yards between them in approximately 4 seconds, faster than Martinez could have imagined possible. Martinez raised her weapon and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The .40 caliber bullets struck the bear in the chest and shoulder, but the animal's momentum carried it forward. Martinez threw herself to the side, landing hard on the gravel path as the bear passed within inches of her position. The gunshots echoed across the cemetery like thunder, causing several hidden survivors to cry out in surprise and fear. Emma and Sophie Rivera, sitting in their mother's car at the parking area, screamed at the sudden loud noises. Jennifer tried to comfort them while straining to see what was happening to her husband. The bear, wounded by Martinez's shots, stumbled, but remained upright. Blood was now visible on its chest, and its breathing had become labored. But rather than retreating, the wounds seemed to have made the animal more dangerous, more unpredictable. Wounded and confused, the bear began moving erratically through the cemetery. It knocked over the folding chairs that hadn't already been scattered, charged at headstones as if they were threats, and began making vocalizations, huffing, growling, and what sounded almost like roars of pain and frustration. Mariah Cole recognized the signs of a critically wounded bear, and her heart sank. A wounded bear was exponentially more dangerous than a healthy one, and this animal was now hurt, confused, and trapped in an area with multiple humans. The situation had gone from dangerous to potentially catastrophic. Thomas Rivera pressed himself closer to his headstone as the wounded bear passed within 10 feet of his position. He could hear the animal's labored breathing, could smell the wild scent of its fur mixed with the metallic odor of blood, both the bear's and his own. Officer Martinez rolled behind another headstone and assessed her situation. Her shots had clearly hit the bear, but the animal was still mobile and still dangerous. She had perhaps 12 more rounds in her weapon, but she was now acutely aware of the other people scattered throughout the cemetery. Any missed shots could endanger the very people she was trying to protect. The sound of additional sirens announced the arrival of more help. Officer James Wright, Martinez's partner, pulled into the cemetery just as the wounded bear charged past a section of headstones. Wright could see the chaos. Overturned chairs, his partner crouched behind a monument with her weapon drawn, and a massive blood-stained brown bear moving unpredictably through the area. Wright immediately radioed for additional support. "Control, Unit 47 on scene. Confirm shots fired. Large brown bear is wounded and still active. We have multiple people trapped in the area. Request immediate medical response and additional units with heavy weapons." The wounded bear, perhaps drawn by the sound of Wright's police car, began moving in that direction. Wright faced the same decision Martinez had made: stay in the vehicle or get out to help. He chose a middle ground, opening his car door but remaining behind it for cover. Elena Rivera had remained motionless throughout the gunfire and chaos, either from wisdom or from shock-induced paralysis. The bear was now 20 feet away from her position, its path erratic, but generally moving away from where she lay. She could hear her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the animal must hear it too. Margaret Rivera had regained consciousness just as the gunshots rang out. Her shoulder felt like it was on fire, and she could feel blood soaking through her funeral dress. But she was alive, and the bear that had struck her was now focused elsewhere. She began crawling slowly toward a larger monument, hoping to find better cover. Robert Rivera, still bleeding from the claw wounds across his chest, had taken refuge behind the funeral director's hearse. Harold Mackenzie was there too, both men breathing heavily and trying to assess their injuries. Robert's wounds were painful, but not immediately life-threatening, though he was losing blood at a concerning rate. "We need to get pressure on those wounds," Harold told Robert, removing his suit jacket. "Here, hold this against your chest." The first ambulance arrived just as the wounded bear began showing signs of serious distress. The animal's movements were becoming more labored, and it had begun coughing up blood. Martinez's shots had apparently struck vital organs, and the massive predator was beginning to succumb to its wounds. Paramedic Linda Chang surveyed the scene from the ambulance and immediately understood the complexity of the situation. Multiple casualties were scattered throughout a cemetery with an active wounded bear. Standard medical response protocols weren't designed for this type of scenario. Chang radioed her dispatch. "Medical Command, Unit 7 on scene at cemetery. Confirm multiple trauma casualties with active wildlife threat. Request additional medical units and law enforcement. We cannot approach casualties until the scene is secured." Dr. Hendricks, observing the bear's deteriorating condition from her hiding place, made a difficult decision. The animal was clearly dying from its gunshot wounds, but it might take several more minutes to expire, and in that time it could still inflict serious damage on anyone it encountered. She called out to Officer Martinez. "The bear is dying from your shots, but it's still dangerous. Don't approach it." As if to prove her point, the wounded bear suddenly charged at a nearby headstone, apparently mistaking it for a threat. The impact of 850 pounds hitting solid granite created a loud crash that echoed across the cemetery. The bear staggered backward, blood now flowing freely from its mouth and nose. Thomas Rivera could see that the bear was in its death throes, but he also knew that dying predators could be the most dangerous of all. He continued to remain motionless behind his headstone, despite the urgent need for medical attention for his mangled arm. The bear took several more unsteady steps, then collapsed near the center of the cemetery. Its massive body shuddered, with labored breathing, and blood pooled beneath its head. Officer Martinez kept her weapon trained on the animal, waiting for any sign that it might recover enough for another attack. "Stay down!" Martinez called to anyone who could hear her. "The animal is down, but not confirmed dead. Stay in cover." Paramedic Chang watched through binoculars from the ambulance, assessing the casualties she could see. At least one person, Thomas Rivera, appeared to have serious injuries that required immediate attention. Others might be injured, but were hidden behind monuments or vehicles. Officer Wright had moved to a position where he could provide backup for Martinez, while maintaining a clear field of fire on the bear. His radio crackled with updates from dispatch. Additional units were en route, including officers equipped with rifles more suitable for large game. Alaska Fish and Game was also responding with personnel trained in bear behavior and wildlife emergencies. The bear's breathing became increasingly irregular, and its movements were now limited to occasional twitching. Dr. Hendricks, drawing on her experience with wildlife, estimated that the animal had perhaps minutes left to live, but those minutes felt like hours to the people hiding throughout the cemetery. Elena Rivera finally raised her head slightly to look around. The bear that had been investigating her was now collapsed 30 feet away, clearly in distress. She could see other people beginning to move cautiously, and she could hear sirens approaching from multiple directions. Margaret Rivera had managed to crawl to a position behind a large family monument. Her shoulder was badly injured, but she was conscious and alert. She could see her nephew Thomas behind his headstone, could see the blood on his arm, and wanted desperately to go to him. But she forced herself to remain in cover until the all-clear was given. The bear's breathing stopped at 1:23 p.m., exactly 36 minutes after Pastor Williams had called the gathering to order for Samuel Rivera's funeral service. Officer Martinez maintained her weapon's aim on the motionless animal for another full minute before cautiously approaching. "Control Unit 23, Martinez radioed. "Animal appears to be deceased. Moving to confirm." She approached the massive brown bear with her weapon still drawn, staying alert for any sign of movement. At 10 feet away, she could see that the animal's eyes were glassy and unfocused, its tongue protruding slightly from its mouth. There was no rise and fall of the chest, no twitching of muscles. Martinez reached out with her foot and gently prodded the bear's hindquarters. No response. She moved closer and checked for a pulse along the animal's neck, though the thick fur made it difficult to detect. After 30 seconds of observation, she was confident that the threat had ended. "Control, Unit 23. Animal is confirmed deceased. Beginning casualty assessment." Those words released a flood of activity throughout the cemetery. Paramedics immediately began moving toward the casualties they could see, while police officers established a perimeter and began coordinating with the additional emergency response units that were arriving. Thomas Rivera was the first casualty reached by paramedics. Linda Chang knelt beside him and immediately assessed the damage to his left arm. The bear's teeth had caused severe lacerations and possible bone fractures, and he had lost a significant amount of blood. "Sir, I'm Linda. I'm a paramedic," she said, beginning her examination. "We're going to take good care of you. Can you tell me your name?" "Thomas Rivera," he managed to say. "My daughters, are they safe?" We're checking on everyone, Chang replied, beginning to apply pressure bandages to his wounds. Right now, I need you to stay still and let me work. A second paramedic, Mike Torres, reached Margaret Rivera behind her monument. She was conscious but showing signs of shock, her face pale and her voice shaky. "Ma'am, I'm Mike. What's your name?" "Margaret Rivera," she replied. "My shoulder, it hurts terribly." Torres began examining the claw wounds on her shoulder and back. They were serious but not immediately life-threatening, though infection was a concern with any animal attack. He began cleaning and bandaging the wounds while monitoring her vital signs. Robert Rivera was assisted by a third paramedic team. His chest wounds, while dramatic in appearance, had missed vital organs and major blood vessels. He was conscious and alert, though weak from blood loss. Elena Rivera, incredibly, was physically unharmed. The bear's investigation of her prone form had been thorough but gentle, leaving her with no injuries beyond severe psychological trauma. She sat up slowly when paramedics reached her, her eyes still wide with shock. "The bear," she kept repeating. "It was right there, right on top of me." "You're safe now," the paramedic assured her. "The animal is gone. You're going to be okay." Dr. Hendricks emerged from behind the maintenance shed and immediately began coordinating with the emergency responders. As a federal wildlife biologist, she had expertise that could be valuable in understanding what had happened and preventing future incidents. "I'm Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Forest Service wildlife biologist," she told Officer Martinez. "This bear showed clear signs of food conditioning. Someone needs to investigate the area for attractants." Martinez nodded, though her immediate concern was with the human casualties. The investigation into why the attack had occurred could wait until everyone was safely treated and evacuated. Mariah Cole, emerging from her own hiding place, immediately went to assist with casualty assessment. Her Forest Service training had included wilderness first aid, and she began helping paramedics with initial treatment of the wounded. Harold Mackenzie and his assistant David Chen had remained behind the hearse throughout the attack. Both were shaken but uninjured, and they now began the grim task of assessing damage to the funeral setup and determining how to complete Samuel Rivera's burial under these extraordinary circumstances. Jennifer Rivera arrived back at the cemetery just as paramedics were loading Thomas into an ambulance. She had dropped Emma and Sophie at a neighbor's house and returned to be with her husband. The sight of him on a stretcher, his arm heavily bandaged, and an IV line running into his other arm brought home the full reality of what had happened. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked Linda Chang. "We're getting him to the hospital as quickly as possible," Chang replied. "His injuries are serious, but he's stable and conscious. That's a good sign." The ambulances began departing for Bartlett Regional Hospital, carrying Thomas, Margaret, and Robert Rivera. Elena Rivera, despite being physically unharmed, was also transported for evaluation and treatment of shock. Officer Martinez began the complex process of securing the scene and beginning the investigation that would be required. A bear attack with multiple casualties would involve multiple agencies: Juneau Police, Alaska State Troopers, Alaska Fish and Game, and potentially federal wildlife authorities. Alaska Fish and Game Officer Dale Morrison arrived on scene at 2:15 p.m., almost exactly 1 hour after the attack had begun. Morrison was a veteran wildlife enforcement officer with 23 years of experience dealing with problem bears throughout southeast Alaska. His first priority was examining the deceased bear to gather information about its condition, behavior, and possible reasons for the attack. Morrison measured the animal, 8 feet 3 inches from nose to tail, and estimated its weight at approximately 850 pounds. The bear was an adult male, probably between 12 and 15 years old. "This is a big coastal brown," Morrison told Dr. Hendricks as they examined the carcass together. Healthy-looking, good body condition, not starving or obviously diseased. Dr. Hendricks pointed out several concerning observations. Look at the condition of its teeth and claws. Very clean, very sharp. This bear hasn't been struggling to find food, and look at its behavior pattern. It approached a large group of humans in daylight without showing typical fear responses. Morrison nodded grimly. Food conditioning. Someone's been feeding this bear, either intentionally or through poor garbage management. Their investigation of the immediate area around the cemetery confirmed this assessment. Behind the maintenance shed, they found evidence of improper food waste disposal, garbage bags that had been torn open, food scraps scattered around the area, and clear signs of repeated bear visitation. This has been going on for weeks, maybe months, Morrison concluded. The bear learned to associate this area with easy food sources. When it encountered a large group of humans in its territory, it saw them as either competition for resources or as threats to be driven away. The implications were sobering. The attack hadn't been a random encounter with a wild bear, but the predictable result of human carelessness creating a dangerous situation. Someone, whether cemetery staff, visitors or nearby residents, had been improperly disposing of food waste, creating the conditions that led to tragedy. Pastor Williams, who had remained at the scene throughout the emergency response, faced a unique dilemma. Samuel Rivera's body was still in the hearse, and the family burial plot was now part of an active crime scene. The funeral service had been interrupted, but the dead still needed to be buried. Harold Mackenzie approached the pastor with a proposal. "We can complete the burial tomorrow, after the investigation is finished, and the family has had time to process what happened. Samuel's been waiting this long. Another day won't matter." Williams agreed, though he knew that completing Samuel Rivera's funeral would now be forever linked with the tragedy that had befallen his family. The man who had lived a quiet, decent life would be remembered not just for his own virtues, but for the violence that had erupted at his final farewell. The media began arriving by 3 p.m., drawn by reports of multiple bear attack casualties in Juneau. Local television stations, the Juneau Empire newspaper, and regional news outlets all sent reporters and camera crews to cover the story. Officer Martinez found herself designated as the initial public information coordinator, a role she'd never expected when she'd responded to what had seemed like a routine wildlife call. Standing at the cemetery entrance, with the massive brown bear's body visible in the background, she provided the first official statement about the incident. At approximately 12:47 p.m. today, a large brown bear attacked multiple people attending a funeral service at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, Martinez told the assembled reporters. 4 people were injured and transported to Bartlett Regional Hospital. The bear was subsequently shot and killed by police officers. The incident is under investigation by multiple agencies. The questions came rapidly. How had a bear gotten into the cemetery? Why had it attacked? Were the victims' injuries life-threatening? Was this part of a pattern of increasing bear problems in Juneau? Martinez deflected most questions to the ongoing investigation, but the media coverage had begun. Within hours, the story would be picked up by national news outlets, and the attack at Samuel Rivera's funeral would become a symbol of the ongoing conflicts between human development and wildlife in Alaska. At Bartlett Regional Hospital, the 3 wounded Rivera family members were undergoing emergency treatment in separate trauma bays. Thomas Rivera's injuries were the most severe, requiring immediate surgery to repair the damage to his left arm and to clean the wounds to prevent infection. Dr. Sarah Kim, the orthopedic surgeon assigned to Thomas's case, examined the X-rays and MRI scans with growing concern. The bear's bite had fractured both the radius and ulnar bones in his forearm, and the soft tissue damage was extensive. "We're looking at multiple surgeries," Dr. Kim explained to Jennifer Rivera. The immediate priority is cleaning the wounds thoroughly and stabilizing the fractures. Bear bites carry a high risk of infection, so we'll be starting him on aggressive antibiotic therapy immediately. Jennifer, still wearing her black funeral dress, tried to process the medical information while dealing with her own emotional trauma. 6 hours earlier, she'd been preparing to say goodbye to her father-in-law. Now she was facing the possibility that her husband might lose the use of his arm, or worse. Will he be able to use his arm normally again? She asked. Dr. Kim was honest. It's too early to say. The damage is significant, and a lot will depend on how well he heals and responds to treatment. We'll know more after the first surgery, but I want you to be prepared for a long recovery process. Margaret Rivera was being treated in the adjacent trauma bay by Dr. Michael Chen, who specialized in emergency medicine. Her shoulder wounds, while painful and requiring extensive cleaning and suturing, were less life-threatening than her nephew's injuries. "You're going to be fine," Dr. Chen assured her as he worked to clean and close the claw marks. "These are nasty wounds, but they missed all the major structures. You'll have some impressive scars, but full recovery is expected." Margaret, despite her pain, was more concerned about Thomas and the other family members. "How is my nephew? Is he going to be all right?" Dr. Chen chose his words carefully. "He's in surgery now. Dr. Kim is an excellent surgeon. He's getting the best possible care." Robert Rivera's chest wounds were being treated by a plastic surgery team led by Dr. Lisa Anderson. The 5 parallel claw marks extended from his right shoulder to his sternum, but had fortunately missed vital organs and major blood vessels. "You're incredibly lucky," Dr. Anderson told Robert as she prepared to suture the wounds. "These look dramatic, but they're essentially deep lacerations. With proper care, you should heal completely." Robert, despite his injuries, kept asking about the other family members. The attack had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had shattered his family in ways that would take years to understand and address. Elena Rivera was being evaluated by Dr. James Martinez, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma. Physically unharmed, she was nevertheless showing severe signs of psychological shock and post-traumatic stress. "I keep seeing it," Elena told Dr. Martinez. "The bear's eyes. It was looking right at me. I thought I was going to die." Dr. Martinez recognized the classic symptoms of acute stress reaction. Elena's experience of lying helpless beneath a massive predator had been profoundly traumatic, and she would likely require ongoing psychological support to process the experience. As evening approached, the investigation at the cemetery continued under artificial lighting. Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Kelly Thompson had taken over coordination of the multi-agency response, working with Fish and Game officers, Juneau Police, and federal wildlife authorities. The bear's body had been transported to the Fish and Game facilities for a complete necropsy. The examination would determine the animal's health status, look for signs of disease or injury that might have contributed to its aggressive behavior, and analyze stomach contents to confirm the food conditioning hypothesis. Dr. Amanda Foster, the veterinarian conducting the necropsy, made several important discoveries. The bear was indeed healthy, well-nourished, and showed no signs of disease or previous injury. Its stomach contents, however, told a disturbing story. "Significant amounts of processed human food," Dr. Foster reported to Officer Morrison. "Bread, lunch meat, potato chips, candy wrappers. This bear had been feeding regularly on human food sources." The necropsy also revealed that Officer Martinez's shots had been well-placed and effective. 2 of the 3 bullets had struck vital organs, and the bear's death had been relatively quick given its size and the circumstances. Meanwhile, the investigation into the source of the food conditioning was beginning to yield results. A thorough search of the cemetery grounds revealed multiple locations where food waste had been improperly disposed of or left unsecured. The maintenance shed contained a garbage container without a bear-proof lid, and the surrounding area showed clear signs of repeated bear visitation over an extended period. Food scraps, torn garbage bags, and well-worn paths through the underbrush painted a clear picture of a bear that had learned to associate the cemetery with easy meals. Interviews with cemetery workers revealed a pattern of poor food waste management. Maintenance crews regularly ate lunch on the grounds and had been disposing of food scraps in the standard garbage container. Visitors to the cemetery had also been leaving flowers and food items at gravesites, some of which had been scattered or blown around by weather. This was entirely preventable, Officer Morrison told Sergeant Thompson. Basic bear safety protocols weren't being followed. Someone should have reported the bear activity weeks ago. The broader implications were troubling. If one bear had been successfully food conditioned at the cemetery, others might be learning the same patterns. The attack on the Rivera family might be just the beginning of a larger human-wildlife conflict in the area. As news of the attack spread beyond Juneau, it began attracting attention from wildlife management experts across North America. Bear attacks were relatively rare, but when they occurred at populated events like funerals, they raised serious questions about human development in wildlife habitats. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a bear behavior specialist at the University of Alaska Anchorage, provided context for media outlets covering the story. This type of incident illustrates the critical importance of proper food waste management in areas where humans and bears coexist. A food-conditioned bear is a dangerous bear, and the only way to prevent these tragedies is through education and consistent enforcement of bear safety protocols. The attack also raised questions about cemetery management in areas with large predator populations. Many cemeteries in Alaska, Montana, and other bear habitat regions had never developed comprehensive wildlife management plans, assuming that bears would naturally avoid areas with regular human activity. That assumption had proven tragically wrong at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, and cemetery operators across the region began reviewing their own policies and procedures in response to the Juneau incident. By midnight on August 19th, 12 hours after the attack had begun, the immediate emergency response was complete. The injured had been treated and were receiving ongoing medical care. The bear had been examined and determined to be the result of human error rather than wildlife management failure. The scene had been thoroughly documented and was being prepared for cleanup. But the impact of those terrifying minutes would extend far beyond the immediate physical injuries and property damage. The Rivera family had been traumatized in ways that would affect them for years to come. A simple funeral service had become a nightmare that would be relived in therapy sessions, legal proceedings, and media coverage. Thomas Rivera underwent his first surgery at 2:30 a.m. on August 20th. Dr. Kim and her surgical team worked for 4 hours to clean the infected wounds, set the fractured bones, and begin the complex process of reconstructing his mangled forearm. The surgery went as well as we could hope, Dr. Kim told Jennifer Rivera in the hospital waiting room. We've stabilized the fractures and cleaned all the wounds thoroughly, but he's facing a long recovery and there will likely be additional surgeries needed. Jennifer, who had been awake for nearly 24 hours, felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Her husband was alive, but their lives had been fundamentally changed by 10 minutes of terror in a cemetery. Emma and Sophie Rivera, staying with neighbors who had volunteered to help during the crisis, were struggling to understand what had happened to their father. 8-year-old Emma was old enough to grasp the seriousness of the situation, but 5-year-old Sophie kept asking when Daddy would come home from the hospital. The psychological impact on the children would require careful management. Both girls had witnessed their father being attacked by a massive predator, had heard his screams of pain, and had seen the blood and chaos that followed. Child psychologists would later work with them to process these traumatic memories. Margaret Rivera, was discharged from the hospital on the morning of August 20th, her shoulder wounds properly cleaned and bandaged. At 63, her recovery would be slower than that of younger patients, but her injuries were not expected to cause permanent disability. She returned home to find her phone ringing constantly with calls from relatives, friends, and media outlets seeking information about the attack. The family's tragedy had become public property, a news story to be dissected and analyzed by strangers. Robert Rivera remained hospitalized for an additional day for observation, primarily due to concerns about infection from his chest wounds. The 5 parallel claw marks would heal into permanent scars, a daily reminder of his encounter with 850 pounds of brown bear. Elena Rivera was released to outpatient psychiatric care, but her healing process would be the longest of all. The psychological trauma of lying helpless beneath a massive predator would require months of therapy and possibly medication to address. The funeral of Samuel Rivera was finally completed on August 21st, 2 days after the original service had been interrupted by tragedy. Only immediate family attended the graveside service, and it was held under heavy security with Alaska Fish and Game officers present as a precaution. Pastor Williams read the same passages he had prepared for the original service, but the words carried different weight now. Samuel Rivera was laid to rest in ground that had been soaked with his family's blood, beneath trees that had witnessed violence no funeral should ever see. The investigation into the bear attack continued for weeks, ultimately resulting in a comprehensive report that identified multiple failures in wildlife management and public safety protocols. The cemetery's management company faced potential liability claims from the injured family members, and new regulations were implemented requiring bear-proof garbage containers and regular wildlife monitoring at all Juneau area cemeteries. Alaska Fish and Game used the incident as a case study for bear safety education, developing new materials that emphasized the critical importance of proper food waste management. The agency also increased funding for bear monitoring and public education programs throughout Southeast Alaska. Officer Sarah Martinez received commendations for her actions during the attack, specifically for her decision to engage the bear despite being outgunned and her accurate shooting under extreme stress. The 3 shots she fired had been the difference between a tragedy with 4 injured and a catastrophe with multiple fatalities. Dr. Patricia Hendricks incorporated the incident into her research on human-wildlife conflicts, using it as an example of how quickly wildlife management situations can escalate into life-threatening emergencies. Her report on the attack became required reading for wildlife management students across North America. Mariah Cole requested a transfer to a different Forest Service position, finding that she could no longer work effectively in bear habitat after witnessing the attack. The images of her family members being mauled by a brown bear had fundamentally changed her relationship with the wildlife she had dedicated her career to studying. The long-term impact on the Rivera family was profound and lasting. Thomas Rivera required 6 additional surgeries over the following 18 months to restore function to his left arm. Despite Dr. Kim's skilled treatment, he retained permanent limitations in strength and range of motion that ended his career with the State Environmental Agency. The family filed a lawsuit against the cemetery management company, alleging negligence in wildlife safety protocols. The case was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but money could not restore what had been lost in those terrible minutes. Jennifer Rivera left her nursing position to become a full-time caregiver for her husband during his extended recovery. The financial and emotional stress of the situation strained their marriage, though they ultimately remained together with the help of counseling and family support. Emma Rivera began experiencing nightmares and anxiety attacks in the months following the attack. Child psychologists worked with her for more than 2 years to help her process the traumatic memories and develop coping strategies. She retained an intense fear of large animals that persisted into her teenage years. Sophie Rivera, being younger at the time of the attack, seemed to recover more quickly than her sister. However, she developed what psychologists recognized as selective amnesia regarding the events, completely blocking out memories of the bear attack and her father's injuries. Margaret Rivera healed physically from her shoulder wounds, but developed a profound aversion to outdoor activities. A woman who had previously enjoyed hiking and camping became uncomfortable leaving her house for anything other than necessary errands. Elena Rivera's psychological recovery was the most challenging of all. The experience of lying helpless beneath a massive predator triggered severe post-traumatic stress disorder that required ongoing therapy and medication. She was never able to return to work and eventually moved to California to live with relatives. The bear attack at Samuel Rivera's funeral became a cautionary tale studied by wildlife management professionals, emergency responders, and public safety officials. It demonstrated how quickly a routine wildlife encounter could escalate into a life-threatening emergency, and how human carelessness in wildlife habitat could create dangerous situations. The incident also highlighted the need for better coordination between different agencies and organizations working in areas where humans and large predators coexist. Cemetery operators, maintenance crews, visitors, and wildlife management authorities all played roles in either creating or failing to address the conditions that led to the tragedy. Most importantly, the attack served as a reminder that Alaska's wild places remain genuinely wild, despite human development and regular human activity. The coastal brown bear that attacked the Rivera family was simply following its natural instincts, seeking food sources and defending what it perceived as its territory. The responsibility for the tragedy lay not with the bear, but with the humans who failed to properly manage food waste and wildlife attractants. The bear was killed not because it was evil or aberrant, but because human carelessness had turned a magnificent predator into a public safety threat. In the months and years following the attack, Evergreen Memorial Cemetery implemented comprehensive wildlife management protocols. Bear-proof garbage containers were installed throughout the grounds, food waste disposal procedures were revised and strictly enforced, and regular wildlife monitoring was established. Warning signs about bear activity were posted at all entrances, and cemetery staff received training in bear safety and wildlife behavior recognition. The changes came too late for the Rivera family, but they helped prevent similar tragedies from occurring at other funeral services. The broader impact of the incident extended throughout Southeast Alaska's human communities. Schools incorporated bear safety education into their curricula. Businesses in tourist areas improved their waste management practices, and residents became more conscious of activities that might attract bears to populated areas. Alaska Fish and Game used the increased public awareness to expand their bear education programs and advocate for stronger enforcement of wildlife feeding regulations. The agency recognized that preventing human-wildlife conflicts required changing human behavior, not managing wildlife populations. The story of the bear attack at Samuel Rivera's funeral was eventually documented in books, television programs, and academic studies. Each retelling emphasized the same crucial lessons: respect for wildlife, proper waste management, and the understanding that humans living in wildlife habitat bear responsibility for preventing dangerous encounters. But beyond the educational value and policy implications, the attack remained a personal tragedy for the Rivera family. A day that should have been about celebrating Samuel's life and finding comfort in shared grief became a nightmare that shattered the family and left permanent scars on all who witnessed it. Thomas Rivera, despite his physical recovery, never returned to outdoor activities he had previously enjoyed. The man who had grown up fishing with his father in Alaska's pristine waters could no longer find peace in wilderness settings. The bear attack had stolen not just the use of his arm, but his connection to the natural world that had shaped his identity. The attack also changed how the family remembered Samuel Rivera himself. Instead of being remembered primarily for his military service, his successful fishing career, and his devotion to family, Samuel's legacy became intertwined with the violence that erupted at his funeral. Every family gathering, every anniversary of his death carried the additional weight of trauma and loss. The cemetery where Samuel was finally laid to rest never felt the same to his surviving family members. What should have been a peaceful place of remembrance became a site of trauma that most family members avoided visiting. Samuel's grave was tended by cemetery staff rather than family members who found the location too emotionally difficult to visit. 5 years after the attack, Dr. Patricia Hendricks published a comprehensive study of the incident that became a landmark work in human-wildlife conflict research. Her analysis identified 12 separate points where different decisions or actions could have prevented the tragedy, from better garbage management to earlier reporting of bear activity to different emergency response protocols. The Rivera family tragedy was not an act of God or an unavoidable accident, Dr. Hendricks wrote in her conclusion. It was the predictable result of human choices and human failures in wildlife management. Every similar incident that occurs represents a failure of human systems, not a failure of wildlife behavior. Her work contributed to significant changes in wildlife management policies across North America, but she acknowledged that no policy changes could undo the trauma experienced by the Rivera family or restore what they had lost in those terrible minutes. Officer Sarah Martinez continued her career with the Juneau Police Department, eventually becoming a training instructor for wildlife encounter protocols. She used her experience from the cemetery attack to teach other officers about the realities of engaging large predators with standard police equipment. Most officers will never face a situation like this, she told her trainees. But if you do, remember that your primary job is protecting human life, not managing wildlife. Sometimes that means making life and death decisions in seconds with inadequate tools while people are screaming and bleeding around you. Martinez never fully overcame her own psychological impact from the incident. Despite performing heroically under extreme circumstances, she continued to second-guess her decisions and wonder if she could have acted differently to prevent the human casualties. The brown bear killed at Samuel Rivera's funeral was eventually mounted by a taxidermist and displayed at the Alaska Fish and Game headquarters as part of an educational exhibit about human-wildlife conflicts. The display included information about the attack and the importance of bear safety protocols. Some family members found the display offensive, feeling that it glorified the animal that had traumatized their family. Others appreciated that it served an educational purpose that might prevent similar tragedies. The differing reactions illustrated how differently people process trauma and find meaning in tragedy. The incident became part of Alaska's cultural memory, mentioned in guidebooks, warning tourists about wildlife dangers, and referenced in discussions about development in wildlife habitat. Tour guides began using it as an example when explaining bear safety protocols to cruise ship passengers visiting Southeast Alaska. But for all the policy changes, educational programs, and cultural impact, the bear attack at Samuel Rivera's funeral ultimately remained what it had always been. 10 minutes of terror that destroyed a family's sense of safety and security in the world they had always called home. The morning of August 19th, 2025, had begun with a family preparing to say goodbye to a beloved patriarch. It ended with 4 people hospitalized, a family traumatized, and a community forced to confront the reality that wilderness predators don't observe human boundaries or respect human ceremonies. Samuel Rivera, the man whose death had brought the family together for that fatal funeral, would have understood the tragedy better than most. As a veteran and a lifelong Alaskan, he had known that death could come suddenly and violently, that nature was indifferent to human plans and ceremonies, and that survival often depended on preparation and respect for forces beyond human control. The bear that attacked his family was not evil or unusual. It was simply a wild animal following its instincts in a situation created by human carelessness. The tragedy was not that such animals exist in Alaska, but that humans had forgotten how to coexist with them safely. In the end, the bear attack at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery served as a brutal reminder of lessons that Alaska's indigenous peoples had known for thousands of years. The natural world demands respect, constant vigilance, and the understanding that humans are never truly separate from or safe from the wild places that surround them. The Rivera family's tragedy became a teaching story, passed down through official reports, academic studies, and family memories. But no amount of learning or policy change could restore what was lost in those terrible minutes when a funeral became a killing ground and a family's grief became a community's nightmare. 10 years later, the cemetery still stands, now surrounded by bear-proof fencing and monitored by wildlife cameras. Samuel Rivera's grave is tended and visited regularly, though never by the family members who survived that August afternoon. The events of his funeral have become part of his legacy, ensuring that he is remembered not just for how he lived, but for the violence that erupted when his family tried to say goodbye. The coastal brown bear population of southeast Alaska continues to thrive, largely unaware that one of their number became the central figure in a human tragedy. The bears continue to fish for salmon, forage for berries, and occasionally encounter humans in the overlapping territories where wilderness meets civilization. And somewhere in Juneau, Thomas Rivera still bears the scars on his left arm that serve as daily reminders of the day his father's funeral became a nightmare that changed his family forever. The bear attack lasted only 10 minutes, but its impact will be measured in lifetimes of memory, trauma, and loss. The story of August 19, 2025, stands as testament to the power of wilderness to intrude suddenly and violently into human lives and to the responsibility that humans bear for managing their relationship with the wild world that surrounds them. It is a story of human tragedy caused by human failure, of a magnificent predator killed because humans failed to respect its nature, and of a family forever changed by 10 minutes of terror in a place that should have been peaceful and safe. In the end, Samuel Rivera's funeral became not just a farewell to one man, but a brutal lesson about the price of forgetting that humans are never truly masters of the natural world, no matter how civilized and secure their communities might seem.